Before there was a Horus Heresy, there was the Badab War, the OG conflict of Space Marines versus Space Marines. The war itself is packed with several fan-favorite chapters, almost all of which are original to Rogue Trader. The conflict itself is rather convoluted, but in my opinion, over everything else, it is one of the most influential pieces of Warhammer lore that got me into the setting to begin with. And as a result, I bring to you today my greatest kit bash video yet. As you can probably guess, I am going to be kit bashing every single chapter involved in the Badab War, including a couple extras. Not only with this, I'll be showing you how I paint each scheme, I'll be going over the lore of each chapter, however, I have some very special friends on the channel today to help me out with this endeavor. But I think I've done enough yapping. My name is Mishmash, and welcome to the Badab War. There's no better place to start in this video than the poster boys of the Badab War itself, that being the Astral Claws. A name vilified within the Imperium and synonymous with now infamy and treachery, for more than 5,000 years the formerly loyalist chapter stood toe-to-toe with the finest of the Imperium's warriors. The Astral Claws would be charged with safeguarding the Imperium's vulnerable eastern borders near the Maelstrom Zone. Once, they were truly the bane of pirates, heretics, and Xenos alike. Under the command of Chapter Master Lofturon, they gained a reputation as one of the most effective guardians of the region. However, as time went on, Huron's ambition outgrew his mandate. The Maelstrom Guardians would be formed, under the leadership of Huron himself, bolstered by the united force of the Astral Claws, Mantis Warriors, Executioners, and the Lamenters. And technically the Tiger Claws. Speaking of which, he utilized the Tiger Claws to bolster the forces of the Astral Claws themselves, pushing them well beyond the Codex-compliant limit of a chapter of Astartes. This was after refusing to pay the tithes to the Administratum, which, I don't know, I mean, Space Marine chapters can kind of do whatever they want, so I guess he technically wasn't breaking the rules, but he was. I don't know, kind of based. However, after the Imperium had tried and failed to bring him to heel, Huron declared independence, styling himself the Tyrant of Badab. The Astral Claws were now stronger than ever, and though it is difficult to ascertain for certain how large the chapter's strength was overall, it is believed at the outset of major hostilities that the Astral Claws stood around 3,000 battle brothers. However, with the bolstered forces of the former Tiger Claws chapter, it is roughly around 5,000. That is a lot of Space Marines. However, even with this combined force of a severely overbloated chapter, alongside 3 others, a 10-year war of attrition with constant opposing forces swapping in and out on chapters when need be, proved to be more than this bolstering force of Astartes could withstand. In the shadow of a ruined Badab, The splintered chapter would flee into the maelstrom alongside a severely wounded Huron. There they would cast off all loyalty to the Imperium and the Emperor. The Astral Claws would reform into several splintering warbands, but none would terrorize the galaxy more than the Red Corsairs. Undergoing his own transformation, the former chapter master would become Huron Blackheart, Scourge of the Galaxy. But enough about them. We'll get to that much later. The Astral Claws are definitely one of my favorite chapters in the series itself. Made entirely for the Badab War, this is the only chapter that is actually featured in this novel series that was not an original of the Rogue Trader Marines. Hell, even their successors, the Tiger Claws, were part of that lineup. And honestly, even though I love Blackheart's design, the original Huron design is pretty freaking sweet. I'm just a huge sucker for silver armor, and I really love the blue trim. Also, headcanon moment, I do firmly believe these guys are Ultramarine successors. They're good at everything, not great at anything, and look at those colors. I'm doing this deliberately to piss off everybody that still thinks that they're Sons of Horus successors. I actually really don't care, I just think it'd be funny. When it comes down to it, however, much like the Badab War narrative itself, I find the Astral Claws to be severely underrated. In my opinion, they are one of the most well-written single chapters in 40k history, and it's why the Badab War is such a special piece of 40k lore to begin with. But now that I've talked to you a little bit about the Astral Claws, and given a light background on what you can expect, I think it's about time we finally get to Kitbashing one. Now to Kitbash the centerpiece chapter of the entire Badab War, I wanted to go with something very reminiscent of their original design, that being very Mark IV inspired power armor. To do this, I would end up actually having to carve off the torso of a Primaris Marine, and I would try to fit on a Mark IV power armor torso. This was a little difficult to say the least. It did end up getting a little too tall at first, and I would end up fitting on some Phobos arms to make things fit in terms of the actual size. What ultimately took place is I had to snip down the belt completely to fit on the torso, and I would fit on the arms and basic pauldrons, along with a Mark IV helmet. This is a very simplistic kitbash to say the least. I know it's not exactly what I would go for if I were going for a more heroic type character, but I wanted to go for something that represents the average Marine of each chapter. The power pack was kind of a short-sighted thing. I did end up giving him a Primaris power pack, though I honestly see this color scheme kind of fitting this design well. Speaking of which, to begin painting the model, I would begin dry brushing dark silver over black. This would give me a great start to the silver power armor that we know and love for the Astral Claws. After this was completely dried, I would do an even streakier dry brushing of Vallejo Metallic Silver. These two silvers combined are my absolute favorites, and they'll be making plenty of appearances with the other metallic chapters in this set. After doing so and giving a nice little shading in between the rivets of each portions of the power armor, this being a sepia color along with a black wash, I begin painting the blue of the left pauldron using Celestium Blue. Painting this over a silver finish alleviates the need for any sort of highlight. This gives a wonderfully velvety metallic look, and I really like how this turned out after 2 thin coats. Already this Marine is taking shape. Now for the trim of the pauldrons, I'll be using Retributor armor from Citadel. This color still stands up to this day, though my pot is actually kind of old, so maybe they changed it and it sucks now. Who knows? What I do know is after 2 thin coats, this almost perfectly represents exactly what I want out of the Astral Claws. But now to go back to the more boring bits, I'll be painting the chest rig using some black and highlight it with gray. Even though I've seen what it looks like, I can't imagine the Astral Claws in my head without a Mark IV rig. It just makes sense to me. Now to paint and shade the rest of the armor and just about everything on the model, I'll simply be using some Oblivion Black Wash. This will take a little bit of time to dry, but once it does, I'll be filling in the eye using a little bit of white, this being bold titanium white. At this point, I had adhered the decal, and this is when we fill in the eyes using a little bit of green glaze from 2 thin coats. After that's complete, we will be left with an iconic looking Astral Claw. Now, I know it's not the most bombastic, and it certainly won't be considering the other chapters we'll get to eventually in the video, but I think this is a good start on exactly what I want to get out of these guys. I'm simply using Primaris for scale and adding everything I like about the older armor patterns to make them look like firstborns. Another detail I didn't really get to showcase at this model is I'll be painting each chapter's bolt gun casing in accordance with Imperial Armory. The Astral Claws have black bolt gun casings, nothing too interesting, but I'll get into more details as we go on through the video. For now, we can move on to the other secessionists. The Mantis Warriors may very well be one of my very favorite chapters of all time, around neck and neck with Sons of Medusa, but we'll talk about them later on. The Mantis Warriors were the second chapter to join the Astral Claws in the Badab Pact, primarily due to their proximity to the Astral Claws themselves. The Mantis Warriors themselves are estimated to be founded around the 8th founding. Successors of the Marauders, another one of my favorite chapters, are predecessors of the White Scars. The Mantis Warriors are renowned for their cunning and guile, bearing adept skill at guerrilla warfare, devastating ambushes, and sudden overwhelming assaults. All skills the Mantis Warriors would rely on and come back to in the Badab War conflict. The Mantis Warriors primarily joined the Badab Pact due to Huron promising to keep their autonomy as well as provide protection. For the longest time, the Mantis Warriors were a lone wolf chapter, not entirely by their own choice. The perks of being alone also came with the cons of not having any allies to aid them when things went south. On paper, there is no reason that the Mantis Warriors shouldn't have joined the Pact. Same goes for the Astral Claws. The Mantis Warriors are known for being incredibly loyal to their allies. So much so that they ended up taking the first shot against the Firehawks at the beginning of the Badab War. During the progression of the conflict, the Mantis Warriors were actively engaged in the secessionist war efforts at all levels. Rather than system by system for much of the Badab War, the chapter played to its great strengths and expertise, fighting guerrilla campaigns against numerically superior foes, and frequently employed hit-and-run tactics, raids, and ambushes. A key element for the Loyalists was the Raptors chapter, seemingly able to actually match up with the Mantis Warriors' fighting style, leading to numerous casualties on both ends. Kinda bums me out, I love both of these chapters. Because of this, the Mantis Warriors would slowly but surely be worn down during the war. After the death of Yarvan Satak, the chapter master of the Mantis Warriors, misgivings and questioning would brew within the chapter itself, especially on the true nature of the secession as well as the Astral Claws leadership. It wouldn't be until piss off, that name sucks. Ahazra-Redth, chief librarian of the Mantis Warriors, would become the new chapter master and would further distance the chapter itself from the machinations of the tyrant of the Badab. Unfortunately, the Mantis Warriors would keep good on their word, still choosing to remain a fighting part of the secessionist cause until the bitter end. Despite holding his chapter together in the dying days of the Badab War, Ahazrad's body would never be recovered. In the aftermath of the Badab War, the Mantis Warriors would pay a heavy penance. Left with no more than 300 battle brothers, the chapter would remain under strength, and would be forbidden to recruit new members. Still to this day, they are critically short on personnel. However, in the aftermath of the Badab War, the Mantis Warriors have formed a specialized fighting unit within the chapter, primarily to take down any renegade Astral Claws. Despite the 100-year crusade they were set upon, the Mantis Warriors were still granted the Emperor's forgiveness, as they were not deemed full-fledged traitors. If you can't tell, the Mantis Warriors are undoubtedly one of my favorite chapters in the setting, if not my very favorite. I love this chapter. And I don't mean like I enjoy them and I enjoyed painting them once. This is one of my very favorite chapters in general, right next to Sons of Medusa. These guys are a big portion of why I wanted to do this video. I've kitbashed them before, and I'm very proud of that, but the Mantis Warriors have always remained as one of those chapters that has always held my interest. Undeniably, besides maybe the Executioners, they are definitely my favorite amongst the secessionists, as their story makes a lot of sense. Despite knowing full well that the idea of the secession was not going the way they intended, they still stuck beside their battle brothers within the secessionists. Now, of course, that can be chalked up to a con in all things considered, but to me, it just proves just how loyal these guys are. They want to do the right thing, and I especially have a soft spot for that. Hell, before the Badab War even started, the Mantis warriors would do everything in their power to stop a bunch of Dark Eldar slavers from completely terrorizing the region. Unfortunately, they get completely dunked on because of space sharks. These two images are basically the same thing to me. Most people remember Sanguinius for being dead on the floor, most people remember the Mantis warriors getting mulched, but I guarantee you there is much more than meets the eye. But I gotta stop myself from gushing about the Mantis warriors. I still got the Sons of Medusa coming up later in this video, so I think it's about time we get to the kitbashing. Now, to begin kitbashing the Mantis warrior, I would first begin by cutting off the brim of a PancreasNoWork, and I would fit on one of the Incursor helmets, this being one from the upgrade kit from the Kill Team set. This helmet has a little bit of a samurai inspiration to it in my eyes, so I thought it would be a good fit for the Mantis warriors. I've actually kitbashed these guys a couple times before, if you remember the time I used a Lego katana for a naginata, but this time, however, I'm keeping it a little bit more in line with the Imperial Armory Codex. His arms would come from the Incursor's kit as well, this being a bolt carbine arm set, and I would end up having to snip away at the pauldron. I end up finding some really grungy and nasty looking pauldrons from the old Mark IV's kit that I probably bought around the time I got into the hobby, but better than nothing. I think these pauldrons are pretty perfect for this kind of kitbashing, and I kinda wish I had more of them. I'd then give him a tabard from the basic Tactical Marine Squad kit. This is purely so I could add in more decals. Now for his power pack, I'm giving him a classic Mark IV. Yet again, from a different Marine that I don't even have the body to, but I still have the painted bits. This is always one of my favorites. I love the little cog piece in the back. I then fit in the magazine and scope from a bolt rifle, and I would call the Marine finished. Now to begin the painting process, I ended up using a much brighter color than I normally do for Mantis warriors. I decided to mix together a little bit of green, roughly 1 to 3 with some yellow-green from Proacryl. This is a very bright color, and depending on how you like your Mantis warriors, I would almost say this is more befitting of their classic scheme. But I like how this looks. I do kinda wish I went a little bit darker, but I've painted these guys before and this won't be the last time. After 2 thin coats of our previous mixture, I'd begin painting the pauldrons using some Sahara Yellow from AK Interactive. This is a great start to most yellows, and it's basically a thinner and more controllable version of Averland Sunset. Downside to this being a thin color is it does take quite a few coats. This took roughly 3, though I wouldn't be afraid to do 4 if I thinned it down just a little bit more. After coating the yellow, I'd begin speckling over the armor using a little bit of yellow mixed in with the previous mixture, just to give some nice scratches and chips and a more faded scheme overall. I don't think this is entirely necessary, but it does look kinda cool in my opinion. Again, if you want to go for that more dull color scheme for Mantis warriors, I don't blame you. This is basically me just doing a different scheme because I've done so many different ones before. Now to begin painting the tabard, I'm using some dark green brown from Proacryl. I would then highlight up using a little bit of dark ivory. I would go a little bit more in depth, but painting tabards is not entirely unique to each chapter, so I kinda count it the same as painting leather. But now to paint the metallics, which I guess is superfluous anyway, you can probably guess I'm using some bronze. Depending on when you see this in the video, I've basically repeated it around 7 times, so I'm saying this to keep myself entertained. Hopefully it entertains you. Please don't leave. Anyway, once everything was dried, I would spray over the model using some gloss varnish and I would apply the decals. I only really mention it with this figure as I have a lot of decals for Mantis warriors. Also, if you're interested in using any of the decals I found, there are links in the description. Another epic detail I'm putting in just for funsies. A great tool to use for pushing down decals is a circular dry brush, one that you don't really use. Just a fun little detail. Now, after painting the bolt gun casing black, I'll be painting over using a little bit of dark ivory. This is so we can do the Mantis Warriors classic color for their bolt gun casing. A nice yellow stripe. I'm a sucker for this. I really do like this color scheme. But before we add the yellow, I would begin shading the model using some watered down Battle Mud wash, mixed roughly 4 to 1 with Oblivion Black wash. This is watered down slightly just to let it flow a little bit more and not pool too much. I also don't want the color to be too strong. Thing to keep in mind with Oblivion Black wash and 2 thin coat shades in general is you do need to babysit them a little bit more than what I would say you would need to with Citadel killers. They do leave some extra splotches here and there, but if you want to go for a dirty scheme, you can work this to your advantage. After doing so, I would then paint over the stripe on the bolt gun casing using some Imperial Fist. My camera really didn't want to focus on this, so thankfully I took a second shot. Now to paint in the eyes. The Mantis warriors are usually either red eyes or black eyes, so I decided to go with the black just to make them stand out. I've painted them with red eyes almost every single time I've painted them before, but I decided to go with the black just to change the mold a little bit. However, again, for whatever reason, there are a lot of chapters in the Badab War that have black lenses. Now to highlight the green, I would simply use some yellow-green from Buracryl as the first color. An alternative I would suggest is Moot Green. I think this would look really good, but I like how this looks too. To highlight the bronze, I would mix together a little bit of bronze and just a touch of light bronze. This is just to make it look like that dull color scheme. If you really wanted to, you could just use a metallic silver and go over using some snakebite leather. However, I thought this would be a fun change of pace. I'd also highlight the yellow simply using a little bit of yellow from AK Interactive. Nothing too bright, just to keep that nice cheesy dark yellow. And with that, our Mantis warrior is complete, and though I'm not a huge fan of this particular scheme, I still like how this looks. Mostly because I'm just a huge simp for the Mantis warriors. These guys are one of my favorite chapters, and it's never gonna get old for me to paint these guys. And though it is a simplistic kit bash, you can't tell me it doesn't fit the Mantis warriors to a T. I just have a huge thing for green Space Marines, I guess. Not really sure why, but I do. But before I simp on these guys too much, I think it's about time we get to the next chapter. The next chapter to join the Secessionists would be none other than the Lamenters. I don't really think they need an introduction, but we're gonna be fair. The Lamenters are the least lucky chapter in 40k history, serving as possibly one of the best examples of a grimdark setting. Like the Salamanders, they've been labeled a nice chapter, though it's not as clear-cut as it seems. At the end of the day, this is slightly fanon. However, they are a Blood Angel successor and are from the 21st Cursed Founding. As far as the Badab War goes, the Lamenters were sort of reluctant to join here on Succession. However, the Astral Claws actually showed a little bit of brotherly love towards the Lamenters, something they were not used to in the slightest. As a result, the Lamenters took their duty serving over the Maelstrom Zone with great fervor. At first glance, this definitely seems the Lamenters were taken for a ride and used as tools. However, the Astral Claws and the Lamenters actually shared a genuine bond. They fought alongside one another in some of the toughest battles, and they actually gave a degree of respect to the Lamenters, something they had never received before among their peers. However, this is the Lamenters. Fuck you, you're not allowed to have fun. Die. At the outset of the Badab War, the Lamenters were at full effective fighting strength, roughly around 800 battle brothers. For the first time in centuries, the chapter was actually well stocked and provided with basic vehicles and munitions, all thanks to the Astral Claws. What proved to be the Lamenters' greatest asset to the Astral Claws and the Secessionists as a whole was their absurdly powerful fleet. Not only just pure firepower, the Lamenters actually had quite competent pilots. Though it may be hard to imagine the Lamenters actually being good at anything, considering they're always getting their asses kicked, they are actually very terrifying in boarding actions. However, Huron was smart about utilizing them not just as a military force. Wisely, he played to the emotions of the Lamenters and often utilized them as escorts for various classes of ships. However, over time, the Lamenters, much like the rest of their Secessionist battle brothers, would succumb to the war of attrition against the Loyalists. After staving off the counterattack of the Firehawks, the Lamenters were already in rough shape. However, the final blow would come in the form of their chapter bark. Being a fleet-based chapter, the Lamenters had no such thing as a chapter monastery. The chapter's bark had the gene seed of the chapter itself, as well as the recovering casualties. But unfortunately for the Lamenters, the bark would suffer several different cuts, slowly bleeding it dry. The remaining forces of the Lamenters would be drawn in, locking them into a full-fledged fight against the Minotaurs one-on-one. The battle itself was incredibly brutal on both ends. Both the Minotaurs and the Lamenters suffered heavy casualties, but the Minotaurs would prevail. The Lamenters, now reduced to 311 battle brothers, would ultimately surrender, and were imprisoned on a space hulk orbiting Sagan for the rest of the war. Now, I'm not made of stone. I used to really love the Lamenters, but I don't know. There's something about them that still bugs me. I think a big part of it is that just realistically I would like these guys, but when I get immersed into the setting itself, it's grimdark, what can I say? It's just the way the world works, bucko. But in all seriousness, I do have a super huge soft spot for these guys in my heart. They were one of the first chapters I really got interested when I got into 40k. I'm a huge Blood Angel simp, and at the end of the day, their color scheme is actually one of my very favorites of all time. The yellow coloring, the checker pattern, the heart. It almost makes me wish they were just a slightly bit more knightly. I mean, they're already kinda there, but it could use a little bump. When it comes down to it now, the Lamenters are not really much better off than they were. They were unable to attend the devastation of Baal purely because they were still low on numbers, and still on their 100-year crusade, much like the Mantis warriors. So, yeah, kinda sucks to be the Lamenters, won't lie. Their Dreadnought Chiron is kinda cool, I guess, even though I imagine he sounds like a mechanized Eeyore. Though I definitely wish they didn't have the natural-born negative charisma, I still really like them. But before my luck turns, we should probably get to the kit bash before things go awry. God damn it. To begin kit bashing my Lamenter, I decided to use one of the Black Templar bodies from the Crusader squad. This felt befitting as I do love Blood Angels with a nice tabard. I first decided to go very simplistic. I ended up just adding a holstered bolt pistol and some extra plasma charges. I thought that would be a good fit as I'm going to be arming this guy with a plasma gun. Now you might be wondering if I'm going to be shaving off the shield design from the Aquila. Well, I don't really have any need to. It's going to be covered up. As the plasma gun I ended up adding is a perfect cover. It's one from the old Blood Angels Tactical Squad kit, and the arms are just Firstborn arms. This does look a little shrimpy, but at the end of the day, I think the overall design of the gun really does cover up most of this, so I don't think it's entirely noticeable. In this stage, it absolutely is. But give it a little time, I guarantee you once we fill in the other details, you won't notice at all. Now for the pauldrons, I did want to do something a little spicier with these, but since I have to freehand the chapter badge, I went really simplistic. These are just generic Primaris pauldrons. I did add a couple other designs for another version of this model, but that'll be something that I end up showing in a later video. As for his helmet, I ended up using this Maximus helm from the old Sternguards kit. I really love this helmet. I think this might actually be my very favorite out of any Firstborn helmet. The funny doot-doot mouth is just perfect. I then drill in the barrel a little bit using my hobby knife, and as a finishing touch, I gave him a power pack from the Mark VI Corvus set. I don't really know why I decided to go with this, but maybe subconsciously my desire to add just a little bit of Rogue Trader flavor in with every Marine is just too overpowering. I also ended up just adding a quick purity seal, and after doing so, this guy was ready for the painting. After priming the model white, I'd begin painting the model using a 1-to-1 mixture of Army Painter's Maize Yellow and Citadel's Imperial Fist. This kind of brought me to a yellow that I was pretty happy with. This is mostly due to my personal preference on a warmer yellow for Lamenters. I'm sure for lore accuracy it would have been better to do the creamier light yellow, but I don't know, I just like how this looks much better. Once the color fully dries after a couple of coats, I'd begin painting over the entirety of the model using a mixture of flesh tone and a little bit of battle mud wash, watered down significantly. The ratio is roughly 1-to-1. This is to give a little bit more of a dirty down look. Again, if you want to go for more accuracy as opposed to my personal preference, I would actually highly suggest you paint with Oblivion Blackwash or Nuln Oil. But again, I just love a very warm yellow. It's just my favorite color. As you might guess by this point, since we've painted several different tabards on other models, I didn't feel the need to go over it with this figure. Now to pick out more details on the model, I'm painting all the blood drips with black. Ever since I started painting Lamenters ages ago, this has always been a staple for mine specifically. I think it just makes them stand out from regular Blood Angels. I always kind of view the Lamenters as the least practicing of the successors. Not that that's entirely canonical, It's just how I personally view them. But switching gears to the metallics, for the golds on the helmet and the Aquila, I decided to use some bronze. This is merely a base coat. Their gold is actually about as bright as their yellow color, so we'll try to match that a little bit. This is kind of a pain in the ass when painting around the plasma gun, but that's what I get for wanting to cover up spots. Now to brighten things back up, I'd layer over using a little bit of rich gold mixed with some light bronze. This brings it to a nice bright gold, and it's pretty akin to what would be the same color as if I used the original Lamenter scheme. The gold is usually depicted about as bright as the actual yellow armor, yet still remaining a metallic color, so this is honestly pretty close to what I would do. Another positive for me picking this helmet, it allows me to actually showcase the Aquila color. Now for one of my favorite parts of painting Lamenters that isn't freehand that tortures me to death, I'm painting that nice contrasting green on the knee pad, this being a little bit of bright green from Acryl. This goes over the yellow very easily, and once it's fully painted and dried, I would wash it using some Oblivion Black Wash. Now to begin highlighting the model, I begin highlighting the raised surfaces of the yellow using a little bit of warped yellow mixed with some warm yellow from Acryl. This gives a pretty similar color to the original yellow, but still leaving that warm undertone. It's pretty easy to highlight over this, and I go pretty scratchy on some areas, though I tried to remain kinda clean with this one. As much as it would make sense for a Lamenter to be beat to shit, I just genuinely get a kick out of painting yellow. Now to paint the eyes, I would actually use a little bit of white, and I would paint the inner sockets using some Blood Angel's red. I actually pre-coated the lens for the other servo eye with some yellow, hence why it looks a little bit more orange. Now for the torturous part. I'm going to be freehanding the checkers for the icon. I ended up getting decals for every single chapter in this video, but I decided that I couldn't use the ones for the Lamenters because they didn't fit properly, so I ended up just using the heart. To base coat the pauldron, I simply would just use an off-white, this being ghost gray mixed with a touch of black. Once the heart decal was applied to the pauldron, I began sketching in the checkers using some black, and I would sketch in the white checkers using the same ghost gray mixture. This just takes a good amount of time and it's a lot of cleanup, but once you get the hang of it, it's not that bad. It's just about keeping in line with painting checkers consistently, and battle damage really does make this go a lot smoother. I ended up painting a Tin Boy in the same scheme earlier this year, so my overall lore and I guess kind of tips that I can use for painting this is making one of the colors dominate the other. What I mean by this is you have to determine which of these colors is the base color for the pauldron. Think of how we use the white as the base color and then paint it on the black checkers. The first thing that's going to peel off is probably going to be the black, so you can allow the white checkers to invade the black. This allows battle damage to be kind of a crutch for you, because I'll be honest, I don't really want to paint an entire army of checkers. I like painting Lamenters, don't get me wrong. I just like to space it out around 6 months at a time. But despite all that, I'm really happy with how this model turned out. Lamenters are one of those chapters that I used to really love, though now I'm kinda meh on them, but I still appreciate their color scheme all the more. They're definitely one of my favorites. Though I do think they are big babbies, I do appreciate a scheme that pretty much hits every note for me in terms of art design. Love checkers, I love yellow, and the bloody heart is just a fun little piece that really brings everything together. I love Blood Angels, and this is my favorite color scheme in the setting, so there's no reason I couldn't love these guys. But I think it's about time we wrap up to the second model, as I feel the more I keep this guy on screen, the more likely he's probably going to break and shatter into tiny pieces. Now to talk about the final chapter of the Secessionists, and undeniably one of the most underrated chapters in 40k history. And, in my opinion, probably the most badass of the Secessionists. Of course, I'm talking about the Executioners. The Executioners are successors of the Imperial Fists, and actually have a couple of successors, that being the Iron Champions and the Crimson Axes. These guys were the final chapter to officially join the Secessionists. Founded under the leadership of Fafnir Ron, possibly one of the most vicious and terrifying of Rogoldarn's later captains, the Executioners were formed, according to their chronicles, for the sole task of seeking out and slaughtering mankind's foes, rather than undertaking any more defensive or strategic purpose. True natural-born killers. Though some may think of the Black Templars as loyalist world eaters, the Executioners don't even have the nails and wear people's skin like a Snuggie. Now, the role of the Executioners in the Secessionist Alliance is quite different from the likes of the Mantis Warriors and the Lamenters, because the chapter's involvement was a blood debt over 1,000 years old at the time. For the Executioners, only blood could repay, even if it meant the death of the chapter itself. During a horrific attack on the Executioners' chapter monastery, led by supposedly a nightmarish xenospecies of worm-ridden, writhing channel feasters never before encountered. Ew. However, the Astral Claws would come to their aid, even losing several battle brothers in the fight. That including the Astral Claws at the time Chapter Master. The Executioners would make said blood pact, swearing that if the Astral Claws ever found themselves in a situation like theirs, they would answer the call. And they did just that. As for their involvement in the war itself, the Executioners were definitely one of the more effective chapters within the Maelstrom Warders. Not to downplay the Mantis Warriors nor the Lamenters, though we have mentioned several times in this video that the Lamenters got stomped, the Executioners were actually one of the few chapters within the Maelstrom Warders to really hold their own. Though of course, we know by this point the Minotaurs were an effective trump card for the Loyalist side, the Executioners would give them absolute hell. Though a fair share of horrifically bloody battles occurred, the Executioners would call out the Minotaurs' champions in single combat. Though over time the Minotaurs' numbers would prove overwhelming, I still like to think the Executioners could take them on in a one-on-one scenario full strength, at least to a stalemate. The Executioners had also clashed with the Howling Griffons, absolutely decimating them, though they were not at full strength. However, one of their most damning defeats would come at the end of the Space Sharks. Even though the Minotaurs totally pussed out on the one-on-one affair, there was a hint of respect. However, concepts like morality and moral codes is completely lost on the Space Sharks, as they're a chapter comprised entirely of violent imbeciles. I don't really like the Space Sharks. The two chapters would clash, and the Space Sharks would be utterly relentless in their assault on the Executioners. Battles became so violent it was hard to discern which chapter the Astartes belonged to in any given moment, essentially looking like an exploded slaughterhouse. Now, of course, as the war dragged on, the Executioners alongside the Maelstrom Warders would slowly but surely be worn down. Not just physically, but especially on the Executioners' side, their loyalty to Huron would slowly dissipate. This would come to a climax when the Astral Claws and the Executioners came to an agreement of neutrality against the Salamanders. The Executioners and the Salamanders had a mutual respect for one another, not exactly wanting to fight. After essentially capturing one of their ships, they would begin executing the Salamanders before the Executioners themselves, which is ironic to say the least. Upon seeing this, the Executioners would completely turn on the Astral Claws and Huron himself, fully seceding from the Secessionists. Of course, by the end of the war, the Executioners would face penance with the likes of the Mantis Warriors and the Lamenters. Though they still embarked on the 100-year penitent crusade, their punishment would not be nearly as severe as the Lamenters and the Mantis Warriors, mostly due to the Salamanders coming to their aid. Though it doesn't really matter too much, the Salamanders at the end of the day are still a first founding legion, so they probably have a little bit more sway. In the modern era, with their penitent crusade over, the Executioners have finally returned to their home planet, and have embarked with the likes of the Mantis Warriors to hunt down a splinter warband of the Astral Claws. I gotta be real with ya, I really like this chapter. I knew next to nothing about them prior to this project, and I have to say they are definitely one of my very favorite chapters in the setting. Though of course the Imperial Fists have a lot of great successors, I would say these guys are up there with the likes of the Crimson Fists and the Black Templars. Despite looking like total barbarians and not too far off from the Space Sharks themselves, they have a pretty high standard of morality. And though they do admittedly have kind of a goofy color scheme which is a little hard to follow, I could see this chapter being a spectacular candidate for a kill team. Truthfully, I do believe that their color scheme does kind of hold them back in terms of popularity. If they had something a little bit more streamlined, I'm sure they'd be at the forefront. But it's not like that really matters. There's no need to act cool and act like you're above it. We all love our niche little chapters like we love our niche little indie bands. But now that I've given a rundown on these guys, let's get to Kitbashing 1. To begin kitbashing the Executioner, I ended up actually slicing away at a Primaris body, and using one of the newer Mark IIIs and completely Frankensteining it together. I'd also add a bolt pistol that was holstered. After doing so, I would begin using a Primaris arm from a Reaver's kit, and I would slice off the blade as well as carve down the connection point for the pauldron. I don't think this was actually intentional, that might have been an accident. However, once it was in place, I would add just a little bit of Tamiya, and I would add on a Corvus studded pauldron. This felt in line with the Executioners. I ended up using some other bits that would have been for them for the Space Sharks, but this bit definitely fits the figure. Once it was in place, I would add on a power axe from the old Devastators kit. This one felt a little bit more blunt than the newer age Space Wolves versions, even less elegance, and I like that. Although, I say that like I had a choice. This was kitbashed around 4 months before the new Space Wolves were even announced. Once it was in place, I would give him a melon in the form of the older Mark IIIs. I had to give at least one of these chapters an old Mark III helmet, and I think this is the perfect chapter for it. Honestly, either these guys are Firehawks. Once that was fully sealed on, I would then clip the backing portion of the Mark III body. I had to do this because I wanted to add an older Mark III power pack, and the only way to do so is to remove the bar. There is no other way for it to fit on. Using a little bit of sprue goo helped, but this did take quite a lot of time for it to fully seal together. It would have been a lot easier to fully adhere to the body had I just used super glue, but the Tamiya and the sprue goo allowed for it to be placed on with a little bit more elegance. Once it was adhered, I then switched gears to the other arm. And for this, I'm using one of the push-fit arms from the Pyroblasters kit. However, I would begin snipping down at the pauldron, as I wanted to add on a more customized pauldron. Oops. This took quite a bit of time, as I did want to shave things down without completely destroying the arm, and once it was fully clipped away, I would add on some sprue goo, and I would attach an old Mark III. This fit in pretty nicely. Thankfully, the wire attached to the push-fit bit fit almost directly into the pauldron itself, and with just a touch of sprue goo, it was actually pretty flawless. Attaching it to the body was a little bit challenging because it's meant to attach to a Primaris body, but after a little sanding and gluing it in place, it was a perfect fit. Now for the final details to really sell this guy as an Executioner, I actually did something a little rare by using some green stuff. Nothing fancy, I just wanted a nice little patch of, well, skin. This would be placed over on the side of his armor, which kind of covered up some ugly spots. But for the front portion of his armor, I ended up using one of the heads from the Steel Helms kit from Age of Sigmar. I ended up slicing away at the lower jaw to fit it in place on the armor, which is gruesome, but let's face it, we're talking about the Executioners. With that final detail, this guy was ready for the painting. Speaking of which, to start out the Executioner, I would simply prime him black and spray over using Payne's Gray from Proacryl. This would give a nice bluish undertone for their scheme, and I would begin dry brushing over this tone with a little bit of dark silver. I want to leave plenty of this undertone showing. The thing is the Executioners have kind of a weird color scheme. It's kind of this metallic blue, and it's hard to tell whether or not it's supposed to be metallic or just straight up dark blue. So I did pretty much an amalgamation of both, and in the end, I think it turned out really well. Unconventional, but if it works, it works. And thankfully for the trim of the armor itself, I'll just be using more dark silver. This is pretty simplistic in terms of color scheme. It's one of the easier ones to pull off in my opinion. For the other armor portions, I'm just using bronze. But I'm keeping rather sparing with this. I feel like adding too much would be really distracting overall. Once all the metallics are dry, you can then shade everything using either Oblivion Blackwash, or in this case, a mixture of 1-to-1 Oblivion Blackwash and Battle Mud Wash. Going for a slightly grimy look is pretty ideal for the executioners. Plus, we'll be adding on gore to this model anyway, so a rough look is pretty ideal. To paint his eyes, I ended up using a bright yellow, and I would fill this in with Blood Angel's red. However, I don't believe this was caught on camera. So take my word for it, or don't, and I'll weep. Now to highlight the metallics, I'm simply using some Vallejo Game Color Silver. I'm adding in some direct highlights with my detail brush, but I'll be adding in more later on using my dry brush. This is pretty ideal to create the scritchy scratchies. Banged up metal is definitely ideal for this scheme. And with the blades of the Power Axe, you can just use the exact same colors. Similar to the Fire Angels, this scheme is actually really easy to pull off. It would not take a lot of work to complete an army of these guys. Difference being, however, is I don't think the Fire Angels need as much gore. And with this guy, I'll be decorating him with enough to make a World Eater blush. But before we get to that, I'm simply adding in another trick that I use on just about every Marine ever. Just some orange oxide, putting it nicely in the crevices of the model. This balances out really nicely with the blue armor. The blue and orange look is just undefeated. But finally, we can start adding in some blood for the Blood God mixed with a little bit of straight up red. This creates a more cartoony look to the blood. And for the gore attached to the head, I would use some dried blood from Army Painter. This creates, well, more of a dried blood look. I wanted the fresher blood to be attached to the axe, and the dried blood to be attached to the noggin. I didn't want to have it angled upward, I'm going to be angling it down from the jaw. And to add an even more detail, I painted the skin cloth using some flesh tone, and I would paint over this using some fresh blood from the Blood God. This is really gruesome, and I gotta say, please don't demonetize me for this, or I'll weep. I also ended up transferring this guy to a different base, that being a Necromunda base, and I decided, since there were remnants of the previous texture, I would just paint over the texture using some extra blood, and I decided to paint in some bloody footprints. With that final nasty, gruesome detail, the possible favorite in my eyes is complete. I love this figure, and considering the fact that the Executioners are a chapter I barely knew anything about up until this video, I gotta say, very underrated chapter. I'm surprised these guys don't have as much love. They have a great scheme, they have great lore, and I suppose they do have plenty of competition being Imperial Fist successors, going up against Crimson Fists and Black Templars, of course. But I don't know, man. I think these guys are really stellar, and I'm pretty confident this model reflects that. I could absolutely glaze the hell out of this model for the rest of the video, but I don't think you guys want that. So let's get to the next chapter. For the first of the bonus figures in this video, the Tiger Claws definitely deserve a spot. The Astral Claws were only really created for the Forge World version of the Badab War, the one that is now currently canon. However, the Tiger Claws, now being more or less a footnote and a significant accessory to the Astral Claws, were once the antagonists of the Rogue Trader series of the Badab War. However, the lore for this was very bare bones. In fact, even the Lamenters were actually part of the Loyalist chapters. Interestingly, the Tiger Claws were actually written out of the 40k narrative for the longest time up until the Forge World era of the Astral Claws in the Badab War series. Despite originally being at the forefront of the original Badab War series, there was nothing to really go off of. And despite being kinda downgraded, they definitely have way more lore this time around. For the longest time, the Tiger Claws were thought to be entirely lost, up until their re-emergence from the warp. They would do battle with some Eldar slavers, and eventually their de facto leader, Captain Vitala, would go missing, and the chapter itself would once again disappear into obscurity. This would play into their advantage, as the Tiger Claws were thought to be part of the Cursed Founding, leading to inquisitorial forces to just leave it be. Eventually, they would re-emerge into the forces of the Astral Claws, boistering their numbers. During the Badab War itself, an apothecary of the Astral Claws, Isaria Seneca, would be interrogated by Loyalist forces. Under this interrogation, he would admit the long-lost Tiger Claws had secretly been taken in by their progenitors, the Astral Claws. He would also reveal that the Astral Claws were withholding their gene seed tithes with the initial intent of rebuilding the Tiger Claws as a full-fledged successor chapter back to its full strength. However, this would never come to fruition. By the end of the Badab War itself, the remnants of the Tiger Claws would become the Red Corsairs alongside the Astral Claws. However, that implies that there are any remaining Tiger Claws left by the end of the Badab War. All in all, I do feel very strongly that the Astral Claws definitely look more the part as the leader of the Maelstrom Warders, and it would be easy to say that the Tiger Claws got a little screwed over not being the full-fledged poster boys, but they play a pivotal role and I think their lore is quite interesting. They're a chapter that has plenty of mystery, however there's enough juiciness to it that I actually have something to sink my teeth into, rather than simply just take a color scheme and homebrew my entire lore around it. Though they may have been downgraded to a plucky sidekick, I think the Tiger Claw's implementation into the New Age Badab War is actually really clever writing. I mean, it'd just be a shame to not have them there to begin with. Plus, I gotta say, they're one of the few chapters that has a bangin' color scheme in both the Rogue Trader era and the modern era. And hopefully I've convinced some of you to maybe give them a try painting them. They're a cool chapter and it'd be really awesome to see some proper love given to them. But now that we've given them a proper breakdown, let's get to actually kitbashing and painting one. Now, to kitbash the Tiger Claws, I actually ended up using a figure that I kitbashed almost 2 years ago. This being around the time of my first Primaris kitbashing video. I initially just started building figures using regular Mark VI Corvus arms onto old Primaris bodies. And the one I used for this figure was one from the Dark Imperium kit. No shade towards the Tiger Claws, but I decided to go very basic with this kitbash because I don't really see them as anything other than Mark VII Marines. I guess if I really let my imagination bloom with this figure, I could do something crazy, and maybe I will someday. But I felt like going simplistic with the Mark VII helm, some Corvus pauldrons, and a regular old power pack would be perfect for the figure itself. What's there not to like? I love basic tactical marines. It's what got me into the setting to begin with. And the point of this video is not necessarily to make every single one of these guys look like a Sternguard veteran. I want each of them to have a nice little flair of each chapter. And for the Tiger Claws, their flair is simply having a cool color scheme in my opinion. Actually 2 cool color schemes, their original is also really awesome. But the faded orange look is definitely something we don't see too often. To actually paint the figure itself, I would prime him and then spray him down using a little bit of rubber black from Proacryl. This is essentially a 1-to-1 with their original stone black color scheme. To paint the armor itself for the faded look, I would use my makeup sponge, and I would dabble onto the pauldrons and legs using a mixture of Japanese brown from AK Interactive and Gold Dust Woman from Bear Cavalry Paints. This is a tedious process, and these colors altogether can be relatively easy to clog up details, so going about it slowly and in thin coats is key. I'd also speckle on a final highlight of a little bit of Sahara Yellow, just to create a nice chipped effect. However, to move on to the metallics for a little bit, I simply use some dark silver. For how unique their paint scheme is, it's really not that many paints that you're required to use. Something I greatly appreciate. Once all the base colors are dry, I would go over the entirety using a very light wash of Oblivion Black Wash. What I mean by this is it is watered down significantly. However, we will be painting the entirety of the figure with this. As I progress as a painter, in one way or another, I try to avoid doing more all-over washes, but I felt it was necessary for this figure. Plus, it's still fun to do. After our wash is dry, we will highlight over the black armor using a little bit of light gray mixed with the rubber black, and we'll highlight all of the orange elements using some Sahara Yellow. I know they're not orange, I'm just used to reading what Lexiconum calls them. It's not orange at all. This is, well, it's kind of orange. Be that as it may, I want to really lightly apply these highlights, and though they do stand out significantly while wet, they do come out a little bit more faded, which is exactly what I want. We don't want to overdo it on the colors, as a big part of the scheme is the faded look on the armor itself. Now, once this is dry, we can then begin painting the eyes using a little bit of burnt red from AK Interactive. If you wish to, you can simply use the painted in white-eyed method with some glazes, which is something that I did with every single model in this video except for this guy for some reason. Not really sure why I did that. But I would fill this in using a little bit of orange red from Proacryl to finish it off, and I was quite happy with it. Again, you don't really need to do this. It could be a lot more simplistic if you wish to. Beyond that, there's not really much else to do with the model itself. I'm quite happy with how he looks, and though he may be very basic, that's the charm of the Tiger Claws. A pivotal piece of the story of the Badab War, undeniably, but I wouldn't give you shit if you had no idea who these guys were prior to watching a video on the Badab War itself. They're more an accessory, hence why they are more or less a bonus figure in this overall video. But I love them, and I definitely want to revisit this scheme. But that'll be for another day. Sorry, when I mean this scheme, I mean the older scheme. Foreshadowing. Regardless, as a bonus figure, I'm quite happy with him. But with him all finished up, I think it's about time we move on to the next portion of the video.
Hello, it's me, John Lich, of the infamous Lich's Laboratory, and you are currently enjoying Mishmash's video on the Badab War. After liking this video, you will subscribe to Mishmash, for he is both cute and entertaining. This step is not optional. You will also consider becoming a member of his channel in order to support his efforts in bringing you Kitbashing Kino. Also, be sure to catch one of his weekend streams, where you can watch him mish his mash for hours on end in front of a live studio audience, and maybe mish your mash alongside him. I'm mishing my mash right now. So please, show some love to Mishmash, or I will find you. The Firehawks were the first loyalists to respond to the events unfolding in Badab, their investigation into the lost Tithe ship becoming the spark that ignited the fires of war. The tinder of that equation were the Mantis warriors, who greeted the Firehawks in the Badab sector down the barrels of their bolters. Although the Mantis warriors attempted a peaceful resolution, the two chapters quickly came to blows, signaling the beginning of the Badab conflict. The Firehawks threw their entire chapter into the fray, with their forces bearing the brunt of most of the early conflict. Like, yeah, sure, the Marines Errant showed up in response to the distress signals with over half of their chapter, but they were mainly there to establish defensive lines and guard trade routes, leaving the Firehawks to take a lot of the abuse. Eventually, they were moved to rearguard duty by the commander of the Loyalist efforts, Chapter Master Carib Colm of the Red Scorpions, but not before firebombing the Mantis Warriors' world of Sacristan on the way out, putting the entire planet's population to the torch, in a move generally regarded as the war's pettiest and most hilarious acts of revenge. You know, if war crimes are funny to you. When the time for the final assault on the Astral Claw's homeworld of Badab Primaris came, the Firehawks were chosen to lead the efforts in breaching the planetary defenses due to their generally superior fleet. Oh, I guess having a Great Crusade-era starfort on wheels called Raptors Rex to slingshot a fragment of a stellar core into the planetary defenses kinda helps as well. To put this in perspective, neither you or your rational friends own a truck and you need to move into a new apartment. However, your psycho friend owns a truck with a 3-foot lift kit, and he uses it to tow RVs and construction vehicles. He'll get you to where you need with all your cargo intact, but your apartment may have a small mobile home crashed into it. You may need to rebuild the apartment, but Truck Psycho's only asking for pizza and a beer for his services, so honestly, it's kind of a steal. Sometime after the war, the Firehawks disappeared from real space, their chapter mourned and honored. However, there exist rumors and scraps of evidence that the Firehawks may have somehow been warped and twisted into becoming the Legion of the Damned, mysterious and ethereal defenders of the Imperium that come to those in times of dire need. However, nobody can confirm this fate, so for now, the modern canon mourns the loss of the Firehawks and looks back on their crazy taxi joyride maneuvers with both nostalgia and pizza and beer.
Now to kitbash our Firehawk, I decided to really just double down on the look from the Imperial Armor book overall, and unfortunately a good portion of this footage was not actually filmed. However, I struggled for around 10 minutes to actually get a tabard attached to the figure itself, so I'll explain everything I used. The actual head is an old Sternguard veteran helm. Something about this helmet felt very befitting for the Firehawks, and while I did want to use an old Mark III, using it on the Executioners basically made it so I didn't want to use it on this guy, so I figured this is still a pretty good usage. As for the pauldrons, these come from the Horus Heresy Command Squad kit. I really like the design of these, and they're barren, so I can do some freehand. The power pack is the one detail I don't really care for. It is a Primaris power pack, but I liked it because of the iron halo. The weapons themselves are simply a plasma pistol and a chainsword respectively. I find these incredibly befitting. With the figure finished after finally gluing on the tabard, I began painting that classic orange color by utilizing some more paints from Bear Cavalry. I begin with a base coat of Sekigahara. What the hell does that mean? And I would follow this up with a coating of Agent Orange. I've always been a fan of Orange Space Marines, and I'm kinda surprised I've never painted a Firehawk prior. As you may know, I am a huge fan of yellow and orange respectively, so I feel like this is a chapter that was just made for me to paint. It's not the vibrant orange that I'm used to with Angel's Resplendent, but I really do like this dark orange color. Despite these guys being absolute petty assholes, I kinda like the asshole Space Marines actually. I don't even know what my point was. I think that's just true. I like Marines Malevolent, I like Firehawks, what can I say? As for the yellow, I'll be using Sahara Desert on the pauldrons, and I'll be using the same color to paint on the flames onto any sort of portions of the armor that I wish. Based on the iconography diagrams of Imperial armor, this is pretty inconsistent, which to me is fun. Yay, I get to do whatever I want. However, I did keep this relatively simplistic. I would paint this onto the shins of the armor, as well as the abdomen. Thankfully, this paint is relatively thick, so freehanding it is actually quite easy. And if I mess up, the base color that we used is relatively thick as well, so it'd be really easy to clean up. Now for painting the metallics of the armor, I decided to use a little bit of bronze mixed with a little bit of rich gold. This is just to give that light bronze color that they have for their trim. It's actually pretty similar to Ultramarines gold. Once I was happy with the application, I'd begin painting the plasma pistol and the chainsword using some light gray and using some darkened down Thunderhawk blue. I'd also apply a yellow stripe using the same Sahara Desert color. If I wanted to go further with this, I probably should have used a little bit of freehanding to make a tiny Firehawks logo, but we'll be freehanding the logo later on anyway. Now to begin shading the armor, I'll be shading the entirety of the orange using Fugan Orange. I'd first planned to apply this in a relatively soft manner, just applying it in the recesses initially. However, I quickly realized it would look a lot better if I simply blanketed over the entirety of the orange armor. As for the yellow and gold, I would water down significantly some sepia wash from 2 thin coats. Nothing too fancy. I do want to have it watered down significantly as to not create any splotches on the yellow itself. I would also lightly apply this to some of the flames. Now to paint the lenses and the eyes, I'm painting them black, and I'll show you how I highlight it later on. First, I'll be highlighting the yellow, and for this I'm using Warped Yellow from Army Painter. I'm also applying this to the leg flames, however I'm only applying this where they meet the edge of the legs themselves. Coming back to the lens, I'm highlighting using a little bit of Iron Man. This is a pretty good gray color, and I'll be finishing off the lenses with a nice white dot. I then highlight the orange armor using a touch of Agent Orange mixed with a little bit of the Sahara Desert, and because I'm fussy, I initially painted the tabard a cream color. However, upon further inspection I realized that they typically have black tabards, so I decided to paint it black and highlight up with rubber black and a little bit of light gray. Wouldn't be the end of the world if I left it as is, but I'm a little pedantic. Selectively, I guess. Now for the final detail, I'll be using a little bit of Sekigagagig, or whatever that color was called, and I'll be freehanding the logo onto the armor by simply sketching it in place. I find the symbol to be relatively simplistic, and it really does help that it's a flaming logo, so you can afford to be a little messy with it. So long as you keep it centered on the pauldron itself, it's really not that difficult, and it is pretty fun actually. For that final detail, I was left with an absolute maniac with a bruised ego. I'm actually not a gigantic fan of the Firehawks, they are just assholes, and they don't really own it the same way the Marines Malevolent do. They're kind of wannabes, actually. But I still like their color scheme, and I am kind of a fan of the lore. I can't feel too bad for these guys for being all dead. But I will say they are very fun to paint, and they're fun to kitbash. I wouldn't mind painting the old scheme too. In fact, I kinda like their old decal better. I love the huge mushroom cloud. But again, been teasing the Rogue Trader episode at least 3 times in this video, so I think that'll be the final one that I tease. With that, I think it's about time we move on to the next chapter. Marines Errant, a rather unassuming chapter on its surface. Formed in the 23rd founding, they are successors of the Eagle Warriors. Like with the Mantis Warriors, I always think it's cool to see a successor of a successor. An Ultramarine successor of which have basically identical color schemes. The Marines Errant are a Codex-compliant chapter, however they bend the rules to better accommodate their fleet-based status. Similarly to the likes of the Sons of Medusa, each of the chapter's company captains and high-ranking officers are assigned flag command of particular fleet vessels, more commonly cruiser-class ships, and are often expected to work autonomously. Like I stated previously, with bending the rules a little bit, the Marines Errant will have individual task force actually recruit aspirants for the chapter, often training them alongside and only truly returning them to the 10th Company for scout training when it's practical to do so. However, they have plenty of excuses for this, as the overall strength of the chapter is around 120 battle brothers. Because of this, the chapter has an absurdly large amount of apothecaries. As for their involvement in the Badab War, it would be brief and bloody. The Marines Errant were one of the first chapters to take on the forces of the Astral Claws and the rest of the Maelstrom Warders. They would swiftly arrive into the Maelstrom Zone expressly to support the Firehawks in battle, having been petitioned directly by them before the war began in earnest. Though they would ultimately succeed from keeping the Firehawks from being totally annihilated, they did not give it their all, and as a result, the Firehawks were vastly overwhelmed. The Firehawks' zeal and desire to completely annihilate the Astral Claws and their allies would be contrasted with the Marines Errant doing their best to simply keep the peace. The Marines Errant would eventually come to blows with the Lamenters, however, this would not go entirely well, as the Lamenters and the Marines Errant were long-lasting allies. They would effectively do a little play fight and call a truce, which drove ire between both of their allies. As a result, the Mantis Warriors would be utterly ruthless in an assault against the Marines Errant. They would face all but total annihilation, just barely scraping away and leading the survivors to fight their way clear of the trap despite heavy losses. However, by this point, the chapter was left in utter tatters. They would restrict themselves entirely to protecting Imperial shipping for the next year, and would only occasionally fight in controlled assaults. After this, the chapter would fully withdraw from the conflict, only being a shell of their former selves. Kind of an unfortunate end for the Marines Errant to say the least. However, they're still kicking. Albeit just barely. But just barely. In M41, the Red Corsairs would launch an attack against the Fortress Monastery of the Marines Errant. In this attack, they would lose almost all of their gene seed. So, the Marines Errant, they're not doing too good. Kinda sad to see. These guys don't seem like that bad a chapter, and they actually have quite interesting history. But if good luck can rub off on somebody else, surely bad luck can rub off onto your closest allies. But hey, at the end of the day, I still think they look really cool, and I think they have one of the coolest chapter badges in the setting. Much like the Lamenters, I'm sorry your life sucks, but at least you look cool. I don't really have much else to say, and I feel like a dick for just kind of transitioning into the kit bashing, but we're transitioning into the kit bashing. Now, Marines Errant is a chapter that I found kind of difficult to kit bash for, as the only bits I could really see fitting for these guys would be Mark V, and I don't feel like paying for Forge World stuff, and I don't really want a 3D print for this guy. So I ended up just using a basic Primaris body, arming him with an Infiltrator's Bolt Carbine, and giving him the classic Go Dat Way pose. I'd give him very basic pauldrons, and the power pack was a Primaris one at first, but I would later swap it out for a Mark VII. The main issue with Marines Errant in this kit bash is I was kinda going for a basic tactical Marine overall, but there's not really anything that interesting about their design. I guess I could have gone for a Corvus pattern, but for his helmet I ended up just going with a classic Mark VII. It doesn't look terrible, and in fact, I like how this model looks overall. There are some things I would maybe change to give him a little bit more personality, but I figured this model would shine primarily through the color scheme. In fact, when it comes to the painting, I ended up base coating this guy using some dark silver from Pro-Acryl, and heavily dry brushing over using metallic silver from Vallejo Game Color. This is very similar to what we did with the Astral Claws, however, I'm going very heavy with this dry brush to really give him a nice bright shiny silver. This will allow for me to use contrast colors over the silver, and I won't have to do nearly as much work. The blue itself was just Ultramarines blue contrast, and over the silver, it pops out really nicely. However, if I were to go back on this model, I would probably mix in a little bit of a teal color, as the Marines Errant blue is more of a tropical ocean blue. All in all, I still like how it looks overall. Now, when it comes to the gold trim, I would actually use some Retributor armor from Citadel. Despite Citadel being on the lower end of what I like in terms of paints, I still think this color rocks. And especially contrasted with the silver and the blue, it's just a great design. I did end up actually painting the trim of the pauldrons using this color too, even though they don't really use this unless they're a veteran. So I guess this is a veteran? I don't know. I kinda wish I didn't do this. But doing this over again was not something I really wanted to do, so we stuck with it. In fact, it does add plenty of contrast, and it kinda binds everything together, but I would probably not want to do that again. Now for the bolt gun casing, I would mix together a little bit of Thunderhawk blue with some black, and on the other side of the bolter I would paint using an off-white mixed with a gray. Marines Errant have a more intricate bolt gun design, which I greatly appreciate. The off-white itself would be highlighted with a pure white later on, and the Thunderhawk blue mixture would simply be highlighted with Thunderhawk blue. It's a pretty interesting color scheme. Though I do appreciate some of the chapters having more simplistic designs, I really like this one. It stands out greatly. Now to shade the gold, I would use a little bit of Battle Mud Wash, just to dull it down and keep it more in line with the blue and the silver. For the eyes, I went for a glowy look by applying a good amount of watery white into the lens, and then filling it in using some yellow glaze from 2 thin coats. It looks a little bright, but I like how it looks overall. Now to begin shading the overall metal, I would go very simplistic by simply adding in a little bit of Oblivion Black Wash into the recesses. I didn't want to really distract from the overall metallics, so I decided to keep it rather simplistic. It's a little boring, yes, but I like how it looks. To add in another detail in the bolt gun, however, I would paint the trigger red, which is actually a detail in Imperial armor that I really do appreciate. Also, I kinda wish more modern bolt guns would just have the handle intact. It's fun to paint full-scale weapons. Once I was happy with that, I would dry brush all the metallics using some more Vallejo Game Color silver. This was just to bring out some chips in the armor, and though it is rather rough, I like how it looks. It gives a nice beat-around feeling to the overall design, and I really do appreciate Marines with battle damage. I don't like clean Marines. You probably know this if you're familiar with my content. All in all, however, I do like how the model looks. It's not really my favorite of the bunch by any stretch of the imagination, nor are Marines Errant on their own. If I got to paint a proper veteran, things would be a lot spicier, but it is what it is. At the end of the day, they're probably tied with the Fire Angels for least popular chapter in the Badab War, but like the Fire Angels, I think they're pretty underrated. Still pretty cool. But with these Lamenter loving softies finished up, I think it's time we get to the next chapter.
Hi, hello everybody. It's me, Arthur. I am here being held against my will by Mishmash to talk about the Minotaurs. To be completely honest, the Minotaurs are one of my favorite chapters in the entire setting. They're one of the only ones that I would actually play if I ever got back into Loyalist Marines on the tabletop, and there's quite a lot to love. So let's get into a bit of their lore, specifically kind of a highlights reel of the funniest shit I know about when it comes to the Badab War. This is just shit right off the top of my dome, so that I don't have to really do any actual real research. I mean, I'm a lore YouTuber. I basically just make slideshows for fun and make up most of what I say. But yeah, did you guys know that there's a Dreadnought that's permanently on forever timeout because of what he did during the Badab War? Yeah, there's like a super war criminal in their midst, which is kind of crazy to think about considering they're all just regular war criminals. Yeah, Hecatoniacos, love that guy. Forge World Mini ended up being involved in one of the worst skirmishes in the entirety of the Badab War. Basically, he ended up getting caked in so much gore that the friends and foes could not discern what side he was on, and a couple of Imperial Guardsmen ended up firing upon him, accidentally thinking he was an enemy. I mean, I would think so too. It's a Contemptor Dreadnought that's about as red as the devil's dick, so yeah, he took exception to this and ended up attacking and destroying quite a lot of civilians, as well as loyal troops that were serving alongside the Minotaurs. It took the Chapter Master Asterion Malak to talk him down, but if you want a good overview of what the entirety of the Badab War was for the Minotaurs, it was kind of that. They were ostensibly just the short straw that you drew if you were in that war. If you were near them, I'm sorry, you're getting casualties on your side from them. If you were fighting against them, I'm sorry, man. It's not going to be easy, quick, nor painless. Shout out to, who was it? The Lamenters. Yeah, of course it was. So the Minotaurs had the pleasure of making the Lamenters swallow a pineapple whole pretty consistently throughout it, and the highlights reel of that one is they abducted one of the strike cruisers that they had and used it as live ammunition, and, you know, it was just really... And to say it was quite unfortunate to watch it all go down is kind of an understatement, because the Minotaurs are never fun to go against in general, as they deploy en masse with their entire chapter rather than just a few companies or even just like half the chapter, and they're also almost always at full strength, so you're always fighting an entire chapter of the angriest and worst Marines in the history of the setting. They were one of the linchpin factions in the Badab War just because of their literal siege expertise. They are one of the best, if not the best, in the setting. It kind of brings up a few rumors that they might be Iron Warrior's successors, but we don't talk about that. So when it came to just absolutely slamming the Lamenters against the wall like they were owed money and breaking holes and shit, that's kind of what they did best. So when the war broke out, they were more than happy to kill renegade Marines because that's their specialty, killing non-chaos corrupted Marines. They specialize in fighting people who know the Codex Astartes pretty damn well. Now, you might ask why they need to have that specialty, and on paper it's because renegade chapters exist that are not corrupted by chaos, but we all know why they actually have that. It's for the love of the game, don't you know? In lore, these guys are the worst. They're worse than the Marines' Malevolent, and it's not even close. They have specialties, civilian killer bolts of ammunition that are pretty funny to use. If you want to have a good laugh, look at Hamoth Kratos' lore really quickly. I don't want to drag this on for too long, but for him, a 60% civilian casualty rate is considered a passable grade or even unexpectedly low for an encounter. But as far as it goes, they have the best equipment that all Space Marines can offer because it comes straight from the Forges of Mars due to the approval of the High Lords of Terra, which allowed them to be basically a bulwark against the Maelstrom warders that were making a bit of a stink. As it goes for the modern day, they were, I guess tangentially, I say that in big air quotations, involved in a coup that was involved with the Imperium when Guilliman returned. They were also one of the first chapters to receive Primaris Marines in terms of reinforcements because the High Lords of Terra had lock on that shit and all new things they get first dibs on. Other than that, they are also responsible for a Loyalist Marine killing a Custodian or two, he was on Terra too, no less, which is kind of crazy to think about, but yeah, they did that and did not see much sanction for it, to my knowledge, but regardless, they're still out there as they are essentially the attack dogs of the High Lords, being used to take down political opposition as well as reinforce specific secret political agendas that the High Lords have. Now, what High Lord wanted the Badab War to be quelled? Probably the one that wanted their taxes filed, wanted their tithes sent in, so yeah, I quite enjoy the Minotaurs. They are brutal, downright evil at the best of times, and yeah, so thanks for letting me talk about the mishmash, and please put the fucking gun down.
To begin kitbashing my Minotaur, I would utilize this Gladius sword from the Horus Heresy Command Squad upgrade kit. However, one key difference with keeping this at least semi-proportional was gluing it farther down as to not make the arms look shrimpy. I probably could have gone further with this, but it looks pretty nice and convincing. I would then apply a Mark III pauldron from the 2017 kit. Considering the body I'm using is ancient, I decided to drill some holes into this to keep along the grungy aesthetic. As for his helmet, I used yet another from the Command Squad sprue. I decided to use one with the larger mohawks as it looks cooler in my opinion. You cannot tell me this helmet is not perfect for a Minotaur. Or possibly an Iron Snake. This was originally going to be an Iron Snake. For his other arm, I simply used one from the Tactical Marines box to keep it in line with the Horus Heresy arms, and I used a plasma pistol, along with another Mark III pauldron. I would have used one of the newer ones, but I felt using the 2017 power packs as well would be perfect. I'm just a bigger fan of the Mark IIIs from 2017. Now, along with the Gladius sword in the Command Squad box, you also get a nice sheath for it, so I thought this would be a perfect addition on the backside of the Marine, especially considering he originally had a helmet there that I clipped off. So I used it as a rug, and once it was on, our Marine is fully completed. I'm quite happy with how this guy turned out in terms of the kit bashing. It's pretty perfect for the Minotaurs, and I'm glad to finally have a purpose for this old Space Marine body. This is a push fit from the original Dark Imperium set, but now that he's fully built up, we can get to the painting. To begin painting the Minotaur's color scheme, I would first prime black and dry brush over using bronze from Proacryl. This takes quite a bit of time, but it is worth it in the end. If you're familiar with my content, this is one of my personal favorites, though if you wanted to switch things up and go for a little bit of a warmer color, you could go for Gehenna's Gold. This is quite a fun process too, and leaving a little bit in the recesses is key. However, if you want to go bananas with it, I don't blame you. What can I say, metallic Space Marines are cool as hell. Now to paint the red on the plume, I decided to use burnt red from Proacryl as well. However, you might notice that I painted the pauldrons the same color. I mean, how could you not notice? But that's not how they look. I don't know how this happened, I don't know what I was smoking. I was streaming this. Yeah, just don't do this part. It really is a shame because it does look really nice and smooth. I could have sworn I've seen ones with red pauldrons. What do I know? Now to keep in line with the Imperial armor color schemes for their weapons, I decided to add the burnt red to the pistol as well. For whatever reason, the Minotaur's armaments are the exact same colors as their armor, which does look a little silly. Though I can't really complain because I think plasma pistols with different colored muzzles look really cool. Especially a nice bright red. Now again, ignore the red pauldrons, but for the entire model, I will be shading using a mixture of Oblivion Blackwash and Battle Mud Wash, roughly 1 to 2. Like I stated previously, I'm not going to be really covering the general metallics of every Marine. I think at this point it's pretty self-explanatory. However, you will get to watch the entirety of the shading process because holy shit was this fun to do. Now, once the shade is fully dry, I begin weathering the model by mixing together some dark turquoise and white from Proacryl, and I would be lightly applying it to the recesses of all the rivets in the armor. Being sparing with it is key, and if you want to use Nihilok Oxide, I don't blame you. I personally just find it enjoyable to mix the colors together to my liking. But like I said, being sparing is a key factor. I mostly just want to work this into the recesses, and even then, I don't think you need to paint every single recess. Now to paint the eyes, I'll be filling these in using a little bit of dark ivory from Proacryl. I would make sure to apply this to the center of the eyelids, and I would fill this in using some Blood Angel's Red. Their eye color differs depending on which source you're looking at. Sometimes they have black eyes, but I decided to go with red as there's a lot of different chapters in this series that have black lenses for whatever reason. Starting to wonder if that's actually canon or just a weird thing that they decided to do with Imperial armor in terms of art style. I mean, it does look badass, so. Now to lighten up the red on the mohawk, I dry brush over using a little bit of orange red from Proacryl, mixed with a tiny bit of burnt red. I'm just dry brushing over lazily. You don't need to be super diligent with this. To keep in line with the grungy look of the armor itself, I figured this was appropriate. I'd also utilize the orange red to highlight manually as well as highlight the muzzle of the plasma gun. I really wanted a bright color to really stand out from the rest of the armor, and considering I painted it using a very bright orange, not only standing out from the rest of the armor and bringing a nice point of interest to the model, but it just feels in line with the Minotaurs. These guys are assholes. And of course, if you didn't notice on the base, I painted yet another Lamenter, except he's a little dead. And I would paint over this using some blood from the Blood God and some dried blood from Army Painter. I covered up the pistol because originally I was going to use my airbrush to apply the blood, but I couldn't get this right on camera. It just kept focusing on my airbrush. But nonetheless, our Minotaur is complete, and I am incredibly happy with how he turned out. You might notice that I didn't even really highlight this model, and I think it stands out all the more. In all lore depictions of the Minotaurs, they are a very dull color scheme, and I think it's fitting. These guys are all business. At the end of the day, their specialty is slaughtering other Space Marine chapters. Something that doesn't exactly require an over-the-top color scheme. Absolute shitters, and I'm kind of appalled that Arthur likes these guys so much. And please conveniently forget that I really love the Marines Malevolent. Yeah. Anyway, on to the next chapter. The Fire Angels. Definitely a chapter that I guarantee about 80% of you probably have no idea existed. Not throwing shade at them, however. I actually think this chapter is really interesting, all things considered. Again, being a Rogue Trader original, this chapter is actually pretty unassuming when it comes to its lore beyond the Badab War. If I'm not mistaken, the bulk of their lore was actually written for the sake of the Badab War in 2010. The Fire Angels are a 25th founding Ultramarine successor. Known for being incredibly zealous and fervent believers in the Imperial Creed, the Fire Angels actually do not hold any revere for Rabute Gilliman, as they believe it is a form of idolatry. Despite looking like they could be a successor to the Black Templars, their battle tactics are essentially even more basic forms of Codex compliancy. They are an incredibly conservative chapter to say the least, and they do believe that the Emperor is a god. This has led to many shared links within the Ecclesiarchy, and regularly fight alongside the Sisters of Battle. In kind of an odd way, they actually have a very similar fighting style to how Primaris Marines fight, as their tactical squads tend to have a lot of heavy bolters, their fire support squads using melta weapons, and their assault squads using primarily flamers. Basically what I'm saying is that they fight very similarly to having full squads of the same weapon. So if you like 10th edition, maybe paint the Fire Angels. They're a little boring, but I kinda respect that. Also, I think it's really cool that their tech marines have yellow armor. I don't know why, that's such a cool detail. Their chapter's formation is interesting to say the least, as they were essentially ordered by the High Lords of Terra, as somewhat of a more relaxed version of the Minotaurs. Also important detail to mention is that they were not truly successors of the Ultramarines by technicality. They were created using highly stable Ultramarines gene stock, and their recruitment base is drawn from a mixture of several different Ultramarine successor chapters. As for their role in the Badab War, the Fire Angels are also rather unassuming. Arriving roughly midway through the conflict itself, they'd primarily focus their efforts against the Astral Claws. The largest engagement would be a battle for the enemy-held Administratum Tithe world of Sagan. The Fire Angels would do their part to slowly break apart each force of the secessionists and wipe them out. However, the Astral Claws got desperate and fought dirty. Utilizing nightmarishly corrosive weapons, the Astral Claws would launch kamikaze attacks onto the Fire Angels, greatly weakening their forces. The Fire Angels would suffer casualties far greater than the entirety of the 3 years they had served within the Badab War. Now that the Fire Angels were in no condition to be a frontline force, they would instead be deployed alongside a contingent force of the Sons of Medusa, and though they were not able to become a tank for the overall Loyalist side, they still played a pivotal role by being a support unit. Despite being good soldiers for the High Lords of Terra as well as the Loyalist cause, the Fire Angels would eventually withdraw from the conflict. They were disgusted by the savagery of the Space Sharks, and viewed the overall war as becoming far more than they bargained for. With the brewing discourse among the Loyalist side, the Fire Angels wanted no part in a potential second civil war. As for their endeavors beyond the Badab War, they fought for the Third War of Armageddon, but there's not a lot much known beyond that. Now, despite being kind of a Tapwater-esque chapter, I really dig them. I'm always a huge fan of metallic Space Marines, so part of it is the color scheme. They're kind of a cool tag team chapter. Strictly personal opinion, don't get me wrong. But I think these guys are really cool when they're standing next to a chapter that's equally cool, or in this case, an equally cool faction like the Sisters of Battle. It'd be kinda cool to run a duos kill team with a Sisters of Battle squad and a squad of Fire Angels. Can't remember if I said this about the Tiger Claws, but if I did, let it be known that I truly believe that the Fire Angels are the most underrated chapter in this video and the Badab War alone. I barely see anybody talking about these guys, which isn't that surprising, they're kinda boring. But I still think they deserve a little bit of love. Speaking of which, let's show them a little love in the form of a kit bash. To begin kitbashing the Fire Angel, I ended up having to do some serious carving of several different arm bits. I began slicing a regular intercessor arm right at the elbow. That way I could attach a different arm piece to this severed arm. A little gruesome when you say it out loud, but it's what I did. The forearm and elbow I ended up using is from the Push Fit Angels of Death kit, this being the Assault Marine arm. I attached some purity seals to it, and I would complete one full arm piece. If you couldn't tell by the scattered footage, this was a Marine that I ended up kitbashing a couple different times until I got it just right. For his main weapon, I ended up slicing a Cataphractii Terminator Power Sword. I really like the look of this super large broadsword, and I would glue it in, though I did have to use a little bit of sprue goo so it didn't look completely awkward. I sliced it at kind of a weird angle. For his body, I would use yet another Black Templar body, and I would attach the arm piece. The main body I used for the Fire Angel was another Black Templar, though this pose combined with the Frankenstein arm, it looks really good. Though the bits are definitely Frankenstein together, the overall arm is actually pretty structurally intact. Once this was all set in place, I would add a second arm, this being yet another push fit with a purity seal. And the pauldron was just a basic pauldron. As much as I wanted to add more decorative pauldrons, I figured the basic ones would fit the Fire Angels better, mostly due to their iconic design of having the two red crosses on each pauldron. I didn't really want to obscure that. However, I did add a campaign badge to the left pauldron, just to make it look a little bit more knightly. I would then arm him with a grav pistol, however this would be changed to a bolt pistol later on, and his helmet would be a simple Mark 7. However, I made sure to use one with studs as I wanted to make him look, well, all the more knightly. I was always a huge fan of these specifically. But now for the final bits, I'm utilizing one of the power packs from the Dark Angels biker kit. Though they are Ultramarine successors, the knightly and swordsy bits do feel befitting. And now that that's in place, I was ready to paint him. I'll say this once, I'll say it again, I love metallic Space Marines. And to begin painting this guy, I simply sprayed him black, and dry brushed over the entirety of the armor using dark silver. This is already a wonderful start to the Fire Angels. This is definitely one of my favorite chapters in the entire series to paint, because I think they're really underrated, and it's just a really cool, simplistic design. With the first round of dry brushing done, I would paint the knee pad using some Blood Angels red. The trim of the pauldrons will follow shortly after this, however I do want to add a second dry brush, this being some Vallejo Game Color Silver. Though the Fire Angels are a little bit more of a chromatic silver, I really like this dark and dingy look a lot better. Especially going in heavy with the dry brush, there's tons of scrapes and scratches all over the main armor, and this really sells the look of a proper knight. I mean, they're basically a Grey Knights aesthetic without the over-the-top design, which I guess you could see as kind of the Diet Coke version, but I still like it. Now that the dry brush is complete, we can then add in the Blood Angels red to the trim of the pauldrons. Pretty simplistic, but I made sure to have a nice good tip on my brush, and I made sure to brace my wrist so I wouldn't paint any other portions of the pauldrons. I wanted to be clean with this. I also touched up the knee pad, as at first I was comfortable with just painting it the way it was, but I figured a little bit of sprucing up would be necessary. Now to begin shading the model. For this, I decided to paint into the recesses some watered-down sepia from Too Thin Coats. This is to add a very similar oil spill effect that we did with the Astral Claws. I did want to go a little bit lighter with this as opposed to the Astral Claws, because at the end of the day, I don't want them to be identical. They are definitely two different schemes. I'm just being light and working it into the recesses, and once I was happy with that, I would paint in the eyes using some yellow, as I originally planned to paint their eyes red. However, I will let it be known that I kind of forgot that they had black lenses. I've painted plenty in this series so far with black lenses. However, whenever this is placed in the actual video, might differ from when I actually painted the overall models. The Fire Angels were one of the first I actually painted. The black color I used is a contrast, that being Black Legion, so the yellow actually did work out in the end. After the eyes were finished, I would add the decals on, and I would add some scratchy highlights with the Vallejo Game Color Silver, and I would finish off the model by adding the slight detail of their bolt gun casing. It's black with a nice light red line. Very similar to the Howling Griffons, however, I like how this looks too. I would also finish off the eyes by adding just a little bit of gloss varnish. This just makes them look a little bit more shiny and makes them stand out all the more. And to finish the overall power armor, I simply used a little bit of orange oxide from Pro Acryl and added little rust streaks here and there. I went very light with this. It's practically unnoticeable in some areas, but just the light little dinge here and there adds more character. And with that, my Fire Angel was fully complete. This was a really fun model to do, and I could really see this being an easy army to paint. Also, don't notice the little symbol on the campaign badge too much. I was dicking around with Goblin Hobbies kit, and I added it to the campaign badge, but it was the first time I ever used it, so it's a little off-center. I was thinking of splashing some blood on, but I like the clean look better. All in all, I really like this model, and it might be one of my favorites in the entire series. Beyond the Marines Errant, I think these guys might be the least popular of the Badab chapters, but I think they deserve a good amount of limelight. They're cool. They have endless kitbash potential, and they're just really easy to paint. But I think it's about time we wrap it up to the next chapter.
The Raptors are a successor chapter descended from the Raven Guard and created in the immediate wake of Horus's betrayal. It's believed that the Raptors originally consisted of initiates still training on Deliverance at the time of the Isstvan V drop site massacre, thus being spared from their legion's almost total decimation and subsequent series of unfortunate events as the 19th Legion attempted to restore their forces to some functioning capacity. As you'll come to see, loss is far from unfamiliar to the Raptors. Beginning as a fleet-based force, the fledgling Raptors quickly left the nest and took flight to engage in the wars of the Heresy, then later in pursuit of any lingering traitor forces still kicking around like delinquent punks after Horus's failure. Being isolated from their Primarch and parent legion early on, the Raptors' culture and doctrine deviated from that of their forebears, but the association is far from lost, not just because of the bird iconography. Always engaging in some of the galaxy's most brutal shitstorms, the Raptors became experts in stealth, infiltration, adaptation, and getting it done right the first time, though this frequently leaves them on the cusp of extinction. The Raptors may be less likely to fall victim to the Sable brand, but suicidal tendencies must run in the family as they just don't seem to be bothered by the idea of getting entirely exploded. Being some of the first chapters to engage in the conflicts of the Badab War alongside the Red Scorpions, Fire Angels, and Salamanders, the Raptors became a crucial fighting force in frontline combat and mobile reserves, often bolstering other loyalist chapters in times of need. Oddly, the Raptors lack almost any sense of pride, hubris, or glory typical to the preening nature of other Space Marine chapters, and there's no example clearer than the beginning of the Badab War. Chapter Master Lias Isidon, along with his battle brothers, willingly submitted to the Red Scorpions chapter master Karib Koln when he was chosen over Isidon for command of the combined loyalist forces. Not only did the Raptors accept this with grace, they went on to build a close and lasting relationship with the Red Scorpions despite their drastic differences. The Raptors became experts at jungle warfare and special ops. The adaptability of the Raptors is unmatched. As they are proficient in many forms of combat, they must be independently capable or risk failing their objective. During the Badab War, they garnered particular praise for the attack dubbed Operation Sedna. The objective was to liberate the planet of Cerngrad, which required the infiltration of a heavily armed and defended fortress that made close assault near impossible for the Loyalists. The Raptors made planetfall unnoticed, over 300 kilometers from the fortress. They arrived without heavy gear or transport, opting to use the tactical advantage of secrecy over force. The Raptors spread out to limit detection and advanced on foot for weeks, using the extreme conditions of Cerngrad to their advantage as they crossed the freezing tundras and icy terrain, often only progressing under the cover of the blizzards and electrical storms that ravaged the planet. Despite every possible barrier, and perhaps miraculously, they arrived at the fortress, completely undetected, and attacked in the midst of another blinding storm. They breached the walls and sabotaged the artillery that had prevented Loyalist forces from destroying the fortress, though this led to heavy casualties among the Raptors, but are we really surprised at this point? When the heavy weapons were silenced, the Salamanders and remaining Raptors battle companies that had stayed off-world attacked in full force, reclaiming Cerngrad after a spectacular show of resilience and dedication that had become standard for the chapter. Later, the Raptors would find themselves on Gargathia 3, a feral world probably created by one of the grandfather's spare farts. The surface was covered in corrosive swamps and blanketed by a sky of dense, toxic fog. This was impossible to survive without power armor. It became the setting of a difficult battle between the Raptors and a joint force of astral claws and Mantis warriors. Arguably, the Raptors were the only possible candidate to take on Gargathia 3, as they alone were capable of matching the Mantis warriors' similar method of combat through infiltration, ambush, and guerrilla warfare. This battle led to the largest death toll for the Raptors during the Badab War. Somewhere between 35 and 60% of their fighting force was decimated, but it was crucial to Loyalist victory. To a Raptor, no loss is too great for the prospect of success. Unfortunately, the war would take its toll, and after immense casualties and the loss of their strike cruiser Ares Vex over Gargathia, along with damage already inflicted on the War Talon, the strength and capabilities of the Raptors came into question. They were then deemed combat ineffective and ordered to withdraw from the war. Several millennia later, the Raptors would add another punch to their buy 10 tragedies, get one free card, when they would find themselves tossed off course in the warp while en route to assault the orc world, Gramnia Major. They crash-landed on Gemidal, a nasty slimy death world infested with an assortment of bloodthirsty flora and fauna. The air was so moisture-heavy that even Astartes' advanced lungs were incapable of extracting enough oxygen to breathe. When the supply of their own breathable oxygen began to run dry, the Raptors' tech marines made an effort to modify their armor, giving it the capacity to filter oxygen out of pure swamp ass. Through their proficiency in adaptation and resilient nature, the Raptors were able to survive on the Death World for 7 years before they were finally rescued by the Ultramarines. While already terrifyingly competent, the warfare on Gemidal only honed the Raptors' deadly skills, and they became particularly valuable in the war on Armageddon, where they worked alongside the Catachans to defend the planet against the Orc forces. Unsurprisingly, the Raptors are currently busy with suffering heavy losses while they wage the Indominus Crusade, and act as the secret backbone of all chapters they fight alongside. An obscure force of elites so dedicated to their cause that they willingly lay themselves out on a quiet sacrificial altar for the glory of the Imperium and the lasting survival of humanity.
Now, unfortunately, I actually lost the footage for the kit bash of the Raptors. Hate to say it, but it is just gone. Thankfully, we do have the painting portion, but you'll have to survive without a kit bash. Nah, I'm just kidding. To satiate the appetite of the Raptors fans, I'm part of that group, I decided to make a second figure. It is a shame because the original one is really cool, and I'll go over what I did to kit bash him, but first we'll do the replacement figure. First thing I did with this guy is utilize one of the new Space Wolf kits, as I really like these poses. So I did get an opportunity for a more dynamic look to this figure overall. A must was slicing off any Wolfie iconography. This figure in particular has very little, so it's pretty easy. With the Space Wolf parts out of the way, I then decided to glue on one of the grenade pouches from the Reverse kit. This is one of my favorites, especially for Raven Guard successors. Takes a little bit of time to adhere properly to a regular Primaris body, but it doesn't take too long. For his helmet, I'm using a classic Beaky helm. The original had a much spicier one, but it's not the end of the world. That does mean I'm out of regular Firstborn Beaky helmets. Damn it. For his left arm, I decided to use the knife arm from the Infiltrator's kit. I really like this pose because it looks like you just slashed someone through, and I really like the extra little tactical rubber band. Did I just call it a rubber band? Cable. Anyway, for his other arm, I decided to use one from the Space Wolves kit. This is just for posing purposes. As for his pauldrons, I decided to use one of the newer Space Wolves smooth pauldrons, similarly to the regular Corvus pattern. I decided to switch things up by adding the studded pauldron on the right side as opposed to the left side. Though it doesn't really matter in canon, I just thought it would be cool to mix it up. Now for his main armament, I decided to give him a Phobos pattern bolt pistol. Just because I decided to use this on a previous miniature, but it didn't work out properly. So I thought I would put it on him. I think I might end up painting this guy in a different video, so I don't really mind reusing this character. Now for his power pack, I decided to use one of the Infiltrator little scanner bits, and I would attach it to a Corvus pack. The Corvus pack with the little iconography is pretty seamless altogether, and I really like how this looks. Matching them up together once they're both finished, it's really similar. It is a shame the first one didn't work out, but I'll explain how I kitbashed him as I paint him. The first thing I really ended up doing to make this guy stand out is using a Sternguard veteran helmet. I love this beaky helm. It just has a nice little bit of tech to it, and it works quite well with the overall scheme. As for the base coating of the miniature itself, I initially went for a lighter tone to go for the original scheme of the Raptors, however, since I've already painted that, I decided to paint the Tundra Zone operation pattern of the armor. This required a base coat of extra dark green from AK Interactive. Furthermore, the bits I used for this figure primarily stem from the Infiltrator's kit, this being the combat knife and the power pack. The arm, however, is where I really kitbash things. This is a Reaver arm from the original Pushfit Reavers, and his plasma pistol came from the Horus Heresy line. After the green was base coated and the decals were applied, I would paint all the silver areas using some dark silver. I also had a little bit more fun with the sponging by blotching over the decals to make them look more in line with the actual armor. However, this is where things get very similar to the original design of the Tundra coat. I decided to use the original green, that being faded green and little speckles using my dry brush. This was primarily focused on the knee pads. The thing I like about this scheme in particular is you could easily apply this to the basic Raptor scheme. Also, side note, there's like a million different schemes in Imperial armor for Raptors. Seriously, check it out. After doing so, I would paint the casing for the plasma pistol using a 50-50 mix of yellow-green and bright yellow-green from Proacryl. I really like this casing color, it really has a lot of character. As for the little lens on the helmet, I ended up using some burnt red, and I would follow this using some orange red from Proacryl as well. As for the shading on the Aquila, I decided to use a little bit of Battle Mud wash mixed roughly 2-to-1 with some sepia wash. I would also apply this to the plasma pistol casing. I would apply some faded oxide into the recesses of the model, and I would paint the eyes of the model using a little bit of bronze. Kind of a weird decision, but that's kind of what it looks like in the actual chapter description. Afterwards, I would finish it with a highlight of the faded green, and my model is complete. And may I say, I've painted Raptors in many different ways, but this is by far my favorite. It actually kind of works for a generic Raptor scheme rather than just the Tundra Zone, but I like being able to apply things in different scenarios. All in all, I do love the Raptors, and now that I have an extra figure, I'm almost tempted to use that for another upcoming big video that I want to do, that being a Rogue Trader series. I don't know, we'll see. You know, it is funny, I used to have a lot of resentment for the Raptors themselves, mostly because I always kind of blamed them for taking up the spot the Crimson Fist deserved on the decal sheet, but I get why people like him, and I am a huge fan myself. Also, the irony that the Raptors footage is missing is not lost on me.
The Red Scorpions are among the finest chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, veterans of countless wars, including the Helios Campaign, Siege of Rax, Badab War, Second Tyrannic War, and Third War for Armageddon. Adhering to the tenets of the Codex Astartes, despite diverting in small details of the doctrine, their captains known as Commanders carry relic blades known as Tears of the Scorpion, which exceed the craftsmanship of even the most revered weapons. Maintaining their genetic purity with fanatical devotion, the Red Scorpions field apothecaries in excess to any other chapter, with their chief apothecary established as their second-in-command. During the Badab War, the Red Scorpions, under the leadership of their chapter master, or in their parlance, Lord High Commander, Errant Ortis, assumed control of all deployed Space Marines as the Supreme General of the campaign. Despite being known as an aloof chapter, their spotless reputation as among the most effective chapters saw their appointment personally by the High Lords of Terror, diverting their patrols from the Maelstrom Zone during 906.M41. Lord High Commander Ortiz slain during the ruse known as the Betrayal at Grief. His successor, First Captain Carib Cullen, would assume overall command of the campaign henceforth and see it through to its completion. Now bereft of their veteran leader and his entire honor guard, the Red Scorpions nonetheless felt bitter vengeance stirring in their hearts for such a callous trap laid under the pretense of a parley, Cullen vowing to slay Luft-Huron as the war raged on. Deploying 8 companies, 4 strike cruisers and 2 battle barges to the fray, Cullen led from the front lines, with his chapter assuming a more aggressive war footing during the campaign. Succeeding in their trials to depose the tyrant of Badab, the Red Scorpions for their efforts were awarded the battle standard, the Vexilla Imperialis by the High Lords of Terror, which their chapter ancient, Sire Caragon, proudly carries to this day. Unable to discover the origins of their genetic legacy, regardless, the chapter has been reinforced with Primaris Space Marines and continue to combat the foes of the Imperium.
Now to kitbash the Red Scorpions, I went a very weird route. I'm building one of the Apothecary Sergeants, but the first thing I added was a power pack from the Space Marines Adventures kit, one with the bolt gun attached at the bottom. And for his left arm, I gave him an Arthesium. I'd also equipped the Apothecary Pauldron from the Command Squad set of old. These arms are a little shrimpy, but the pose does help the overall Marine in terms of the overall proportions. His main armament would be simplistic in the form of a bolt pistol. Since he already has the bolter attached to his power pack, a bolt pistol seemed like the best option. The pauldron itself would be blank, as I wanted to add in the decal. As you can probably tell, these are old Space Marine bits. But again, like the others, don't mind it too much. I'm going for a grungy look to begin with. Now for his helmet, I decided to go with a classic Mark IV. Though I could have just used a Primaris helmet, I do think these small details really do add up. I'm not a huge fan of the Primaris kitty ears, and I just like having a little bit more detail to work with, especially on the ears. Now for the painting. As you can see, I kind of started filming a little bit late into the process, but trust me, you're not missing out on anything. The main color I used for the gray power armor is Revenn Skill from Bear Cavalry. This is a really great color for the Red Scorpions, as their gray is rather particular. It's kind of a warm gray, something that you don't see all too often besides maybe Relictors. Though it's probably not Codex compliant, I did not paint this guy with any apothecary colors. I wanted to go with the basic color scheme overall. As for his pauldrons, I would simply use black for the main color, and for the trim, I would use Sahara Yellow. Okay. Sahara Yellow for the trim. Like I said, you're not missing much. All these portions are basic, and I wasn't really finished with any of them by this point in the filming. I'd also use this color to form the iconic yellow stripe down the center of the helmet. This is probably the least in line with the Codex compliant look, but I still like how it looks. It's amalgamation of Red Scorpion stuff. Now to paint the bolt gun casing, which might be my very favorite in the entire lineup, I'm going to start by base coating using burnt red from Buracryl. I really like this color scheme, and I think it's a great callback. Besides flame designs, the bolt gun casing is identical to their original alternate color scheme, that being the red and black. All we gotta do is paint it in a diagonal line to create 2 thin lines along the side of the case. The triangular and sloped look of the bolt gun casing along with the stripes is something that you don't see all too often, and it makes me want to do it myself on maybe some custom Marines. Again, like I said, custom bolt gun casings are really a small but kind of imperative detail with each of these chapters. Just adds that nice little extra spice, and I'm really glad that I included it in this video. Once we've done so, we can then begin painting the metallics using dark silver. This includes the Imperialis symbol, as well as all the little details on the bolt guns and the Narthesium. As for the Apothecary symbol, I'm using more burnt red. I would have preferred using a decal had I had the choice, but this piece was really glued onto the Narthecium. Not the end of the world, however. I think it's kinda cool to have molded in pieces. The red is also useful for painting in the other details on the Narthecium as well. That being the little blood vial and the even smaller apothecary symbol. Seems a little redundant, but whatever. As for the Imperialis symbol, I decided to finish it off by simply using a little bit of snakebite leather for that very darkened gold color. I've done this before on other Marines, but I think this is most fitting for the Red Scorpions overall. Once that dries, I then begin shading all the metallics using some Oblivion Blackwash from 2 thin coats. This also includes the bolt gun casings. I'd also add it to the recesses of the black itself, and I would try to keep it in line without messing up any of the gray. The shading on the gray armor itself would be a controlled one, as I am mostly pushing this into the recesses. It could be an all-over wash, but I don't think that's necessary. I prefer to keep it a little bit more clean with this scheme, as the gray is not super worn down. Well, there actually is one that I could have done to be really beat around, but I feel like that would be a cop-out more than anything. Convenient one I could have taken, but whatever. Now to highlight the gray, I'm going for a stark highlight using some glass moonlight from Bear Cavalry. This adds a severely chipped look to the armor overall, very beat around, and exactly what I want to go for. This adds some pretty serious contrast, and I really like how this looks overall. I probably could have gone a little bit more subtle, but I don't know, I just prefer the look overall, and it looks kind of cartoony in a way that I really enjoy. Now to highlight the bolt gun casings, I'm using orange red from Proacryl. This really brings out the overall red color, and really contrasts nicely with the gray. I also applied this to all the red elements, including the Narthecium as well as the apothecary symbol. Now to finish off the yellow, I would use a little bit of warped yellow from Army Painter. This is a bright banana yellow, and it contrasts nicely with this mustard yellow. It's a terrible, gross combination, but what can you say? If you haven't lost your appetite yet, hopefully you like how I painted this up, because I'm pretty happy with it overall. Though I will admit, I do think I could have done a little bit better with this model. It's not my least favorite, but there are definitely things that could be improved. Which kind of leads me to saying that maybe I should kitbash another Red Scorpion on the channel later on. There's a lot of you that really like this chapter, and I really want to do it justice. That isn't to say that I'm disappointed with this model, I just think the idea wasn't executed as well as I could have. Regardless, it's still pretty neat in my opinion, just like the next model.
The Howling Griffons are the most exemplary knights of the Adeptus Astartes, their honor and temperance putting the knightly orders of the Dark Angels and Black Templars to shame. They are true paladins in shining armor, who ride an endless charge propelled by their oaths to themselves and their allies. Cower, ye faithless, at the long shadow cast by their wings. In the Badab War, a task force of 250 Griffons had answered hails from the Loyalist forces, and were tasked with protecting supply convoys and overseeing the refurbishment of old radio stations in the Kamara system. This would unfortunately put them in the charge of the Executioners chapter, who royally decimated about 70% of their forces, including a hallowed strike cruiser and their beloved chaplain Dreadnought, rest in peace. Fortunately, our mighty Griffons forced the Executioners to withdraw from their wrathful talons, and continued to fight in the war as saboteurs who picked Huron's forces apart until they were eventually ordered to regroup. These red and yellow Marines are like troubadours of old, forging their legend with every battle, honing their blades and bolters with every devastating strike, and responding to any soul calling for the aid of the Emperor's angels. If you seek to embody the symbol of hope that the Imperium believes the Astartes to be, listen for the beats of their wings and watch their parchments blaze like fire on their trail. And where are they now? The Howling Griffons of today remain at the spearhead alongside their brothers in arms as they burn Mortarian's plagues to hallowed cinders and shatter the axes of Angron's berserkers against their shields. If the ruinous powers seek to sow entropy into the galaxy, they must break the Griffons' ironclad resolve as they howl their pledges in defiance against the night.
I decided to use one of the Crusader bodies from the Black Templars kit as a base for the Howling Griffon, which is just kind of perfect in my opinion. For his arms, I'm using M6 Corvus arms, and I'm yet again gluing these downward to not make them look too shrimpy. For his melee weapon, I decided to use this huge broadsword from the Grey Knights and Scepters kit, which again, just too damn fitting with the Black Templars armor for a Howling Griffon. I am incredibly pleased with the pose I was able to pull off with this right out of the gates. And another big feature of why this works so well is the handle of the sword itself actually clips with his ass, so I can glue it on easier and it can have 2 points of connection. I think by this point I realized that there is no ruining this model, so I just kept adding on. For his pauldrons, I decided to go with the Mark III pauldrons from the 2017 kit as well. I should just say now, if there's anything else Mark III related that I use in these kit bashes, just assume it's from the 2017 kit. I don't even own the newer ones. Actually, that's a lie, I have a couple bodies, but that doesn't matter. These fit on incredibly well, and though the arms are a little short, I don't really mind how it looks. Once those were in place, I'd begin slicing away at the Black Templar Purity Seal, and I would replace it using a regular wax seal from another blank one. However, this did take a couple of tries, but once it was applied, it worked out pretty well. Once it was in place, I would arm him with a bolt pistol on his left arm, and I would give him a classic power pack, and a helm from the Contemptor Dreadnought kit. This was kind of a last-minute decision. I was just going to use one of the Black Templar helmets, and originally this was going to be for the Star Phantom, but I like this helmet better and it feels more befitting for the Howling Griffons. But now that he's kit bashed, I'd begin painting him. And to do so, I would first prime him using some black, and I would paint the pauldrons using some white. I used an off-white for the main portion of the pauldrons, and I would highlight using scritchy scratchies using pure white. I then began base coating his tabard using dark green-brown from Prorocro, and this would take a couple of coats. I then began painting over the white on the pauldrons using some Imperial Fist contrast. As you can see, using that undercoat of the little scritchy scratchies goes a long way. However, you're probably going to be seeing the Lamenters or the Salamanders be much easier than this, so depending on where I put this in the video, this is probably something super easy for you by this point. But this is where things get complicated, as the blackout scheme has a checkered pattern on the pauldron itself. Since we already have our base of yellow, we can begin painting on using burnt red for the red sections. This isn't too hard, you just need to have a steady hand and a good tip on your brush. If you mess up, it's really not the end of the world to clean up with contrast. Or if you just want to do some battle damage. I certainly do. The biggest key factor is just letting yourself be patient. The more impatient you are, the more likely you're probably going to mess up. Remember, this is not an easy scheme, and good things come with patience. Some fortune cookie advice for you. But once I was happy with the red on the armor, I began mixing together some pale white and just a little bit of the Imperial Fist to paint on some scritchy scratchies. You can do this as much as you want, but I do recommend going light with this. Now to come back to the tabard, I'm now layering over using some khaki. This is a pretty simplistic process, you just need to highlight over the raised surfaces. Can I just take this moment to say, I don't like painting black power armor. I've never been a fan of it. Hence why I went rather rough with the overall color scheme on the black armor itself. I began highlighting first using some rubber black, and I would slowly mix in some neutral gray to really mix up the highlights and add in the scratches. Not to cope and seethe too much, but I'm almost a little happy with how it turned out considering it kind of looks like a weird cel-shaded design. But if you think I just suck at painting black armor, let me know in the comments. I actually couldn't quite tell you why I suck at it so badly. I know how to do it, I just am never really good at doing it on camera, I guess. Regardless, to move on from the black power armor for a bit, I began base coating the trim of the pauldrons as well as the Aquila using some dark silver. I actually don't end up painting the Aquila until later on because I couldn't quite figure out whether or not I wanted to do a bone color for the Aquila or a dark gold. It's kind of hard to determine which color this is supposed to be. But coming back to the black armor, I would finish it off using a very sharp highlight of pure neutral gray right on the sharpest edges. This is where things really pop out, and I think I did kind of fix the black armor a little bit with this. But again, some of my highlights are really thick and really cartoony, so depending on how you look at it, this either looks kind of meh, or it looks kind of cool. I like to try to make lemonade out of lemons at the end of the day. And to begin shading the metallics, I'm using some Oblivion Blackwash from 2 thin coats. I'm going quite light with this. I don't want to go too hard with it as to blend it in with the rest of the armor, but just enough to really bring out the shadows and the brighter highlights. Now, coming back into the tabard, I would mix together some khaki, roughly 3:1, with some dark ivory to really bring out the brighter edges. This is just sketched on to give it more of a cloth-like feel. Now, to finish off the Aquila, I would simply apply some snakebite leather over the metallics, and it would give us that wonderful dull gold color. Snakebite leather might be one of my favorite contrasts for just this alone. Now, to paint in the eyes, it's a little difficult to see, but I ended up painting these using Carandaros green over a nice sliver of white like we did with all the other Marines. Now, to finish off the metallics, I'm using silver metallic from Vallejo Game Color. I almost think this is a little too bright for the overall metallics, but I'm happy with how it turned out. And to keep in line with the bolt casing for his bolt pistol, I would add in a line of burnt red and a line of warm yellow. It's a simplistic scheme, but I really like how this looks overall. Definitely one of the more simplistic designs in the Imperial Armory Codex, but I really like how this looks. It really does just drive home the overall color scheme. But with the decals applied, I am really happy with how this figure turned out. Though I don't like painting black power armor, I'm still really happy with how he looks. It's just such a great pose, and overall, I just really like this color scheme in general. I like the Howling Griffons to begin with anyway. Considering I already painted one on the channel prior, it's really fun to finally do this scheme. Though I feel like there's more that I could do with it as well. Maybe another video sometime. But not to yap too much about this figure in particular, I think it's about time we get to the next one.
The NovaMarines are a chapter of Space Marines debuting from the days of the Great Crusade, as they were one of the chapters that was formed during the Second Founding when Guilliman carved up the legions like Thanksgiving turkey. Their homeworld, Anorum, was once an amazing place of Ultramar, as all places the Ultramarines grace are, until the Word-Bearers and World Eaters did a funny and glassed it a little bit. It was reclaimed by the Ultramarines, but now is a savage, regressed society, though this hasn't affected the chapter much. Their adherence to the Codex Astartes means they aren't really that different from the Ultramarines, tribal tattoos aside. As a chapter, the NovaMarines are your classic Ultramarine successors. Love the Primarch, follow the Codex, and maybe beat the hell out of anyone who makes fun of it. There is one thing that makes them stand out, however. They really don't like things that are different. Now, this isn't a totally unique attitude. While there are plenty of different cultures in the Imperium and ways to worship Big E, for example, you gotta follow baseline Imperium ideology and worship Big E. You can worship him as Zeus or Odin or whatever, but you better be praying to him, you silly little guy. Chaos, of course, is bad, but Xenos are corruptions of the holy human form and must be purged for their deviancy from it. And the NovaMarines take this to heart because the power of intense racism guides their hand. Part of this stems from them being involved in the nightmare engines of the Pale Wasting, that really cool sounding event in the Imperium's history we know nothing about because Chaos Space Marines weren't involved. Presumably they got smashed up pretty bad from whatever came out because they really do not like Xenos at all. Tau, the blueberries will become smoothies. Necrons, well that's an AI and a Xeno, obliterate that thing, dude. Eldar, they probably start foaming at the mouth because they're the closest to the human form and all the more wrong for it. Their part in the Badab War wasn't all that glamorous, but they were still doing their part in the fighting. They sent in 2 companies, which isn't quite equal to the Minotaurs en masse descending to beat the shit out of the Lamenters, but it's still a respectable force. 2 companies are a lot of Marines by modern 40k standards, give them some credit. They were largely a response force for other Space Marine chapters during the conflict. If a given Loyalist chapter needed a hand, those companies would rush in to stabilize and give their assistance, and they also helped with some light garrison duty here and there. Not the most glamorous of jobs, it's true, but the kind of thing that is very good to have in a war. After 2 years of relatively unnoteworthy but still valiant service to the Imperium in the war, they then left. Why did they leave? Why, because orcs were attacking their homeworld, and no amount of Space Marine traitors were going to quell the righteous fury of their unending racism. Now true, they may have been sent away from the Badab War by the Inquisition, as the Inquisition wanted chapters giving it their all, and the NovaMarines' hearts weren't quite in it. But really, do you think they needed the encouragement? Their hearts weren't in it because they were fighting renegade Marines, and those guys don't deviate that much from things like the human form. But those dirty aliens, now that's where their true passion lies in war. Ever since then, they spent some time fighting the Tau because alien, but the 13th Black Crusade was a big enough conflict that even they had to partake in it. No doubt they took heavy losses, but they still had enough fellas left to help Guilliman in his own side quest to reach Terra and talk to his dad. After that, they served during the Plague Wars, keeping the Death Guard from spreading super space diseases across Ultramar, taking heavy casualties and even suffering from the death of their chapter master, but nonetheless holding their own. For their part in the conflict, they were rewarded with becoming one of the 10 shield chapters of Ultramar, chapters of Marines whose entire purpose is defending the region. I could not find the planet they are based out of, I am sorry. Presumably, though, every now and again, a squad or two of them will sneak out from their posts and go commit various hate crimes on Eldar craft worlds. Their battle tactics are heavily adherent to the Codex Astartes, so they are also very willing to help Imperial forces against enemies. Mankind is sacred, and the Imperium is usually fighting people that are different and therefore wrong, so they charge them to help everyone from the Guard to fellow Marines. Of note is that they have a large amount of ancient equipment and even some archaeotech, which makes sense when you consider they're a second founding chapter. Their origins date back to the chapters being Legion, so it's only natural they have some of the best toys around. To know if you should paint your Space Marines as a NovaMarine army, it's very simple. There's only 2 simple check marks you need to fill. 1. Do you think you can stomach painting the quartered pattern they have, of which white is one of the colors? 2. Do you unironically judge people for playing Xeno's armies? If the answers to these questions are yes, then Godspeed, NovaMarine in the making. May space racism guide you to victory.
To begin kitbashing the NovaMarine, I decided to go pretty simplistic. I'm just using an intercessor body like the rest of the figures, but I am slicing away at the Imperialis symbol. You'll probably notice that he did have a basic power pack from the Mark 7 kit attached as well. I did accidentally detach this, but we'll be reattaching it later on. I really wanted to make things smooth, and I'll be adding in details later on to fill out the chest piece, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Next, for his armaments, I decided to give him a bolt carbine from the Reaver's kit, and I would slice away at the bigger pauldron, and I would attach on some Corvus pauldrons as I'm just going for a beaky. Part of me really wanted to green stuff on something akin to the Mark 7 chest piece, but I'm just not that good at green stuff, so I decided to add in other elements later on. However, to finish off the beaky look, I'm simply using a Mark 6 helm from the Tactical Squad. For his power pack, I decided to use one of the Mark 6s from the Horus Heresy line, as I thought it might be better fitting than a Mark 7. However, both probably would have looked just fine. Thing is the NovaMarines have never been a chapter that particularly go all out with decorative elements, so I decided to go pretty simplistic with these guys. I would add in an extra bolt pistol holstered on the side and some extra magazines, but not much else. I didn't think it was entirely necessary, but I did add in some extra bits off-screen apparently. As one final on-screen element, I ended up giving him an old tabard from the old Command Squad. Very classic Space Marine look. However, as we get into the painting, you'll notice that I ended up giving him a pendant on his chest piece of one of the little tokens that comes with the Infiltrator Squad. I would basically make a makeshift purity seal. I felt this pendant kind of depicted the chapter badge quite well. This could also work for the Sons of Medusa. Funny that we have 2 chapters with almost identical chapter badges. Anyway, for the painting, I decided to base coat the whiter elements of the NovaMarines using some dark ivory. I know I'm kind of going with a bone color, but as we highlight up, it'll look more akin to the classic white that we have for the NovaMarines. I guess you could go with a lighter color, maybe Rakarth Flesh, but I wanted to go with this just to make him stand out a little bit more. However, for the blue, I would use Macragge Blue. Being that they are Ultramarine successors, it only makes sense. Plus, this is one of the best blues on the market. Both of these colors require 2 thin coats, and when doing quartered patterns, you just gotta be patient. Repainting is kind of a key factor with me anyway, so don't feel ashamed if you have to go back in. Now for all the metallics, I'm base coating using black. There's only really one decorative element I'm worrying about with this, and that's the pendant. However, I would paint this up using bronze off screen. Now for the bolt gun casing. I would actually end up using a mixture of Thunderhawk blue mixed with a little black. The NovaMarines scheme for their bolters is not that flashy, so I didn't really add too much. Now to wash the entirety of the mini, I'm mixing together a little bit of Oblivion Black Wash, roughly 1 to 3 of some Battle Mud Wash, and I am watering this down significantly. This leaves it so I don't overwash the white, and there's still plenty of wash to effectively shade in the blue. This is a pretty classic method of shading. Honestly, feels really good to just go hog wild and wash the entire mini. After the shade is fully dried, I would paint in the eyes using some white. This would be followed up by a little bit of Bloodletter. However, I understand if most people do not have Bloodletter anymore. So, if you want to use an alternative, Too Thin Coat's Red Glaze. Now to begin highlighting the pale bone color, I would mix together Too Thin Coat's Trooper White 1-to-1 with the Dark Ivory. This would start out with re-establishing the bone color, and once we highlight with full Trooper White, it'll be kinda perfect. Now I understand if you want to go with a cooler white, but canonically the off-white for the NovaMarines has always been on the warmer side. However, mine is rather warm, so I understand if you want to brighten it up a little bit. As for the blue sections, I'd begin highlighting using Caligar Blue, and I would add in some scratchy highlights all over. I did some dirty color schemes on the other Marines in this video, but for whatever reason these guys I wanted to go pretty hog wild with it. I don't know what it is, maybe it's because I went with a more simplistic kit bash, I wanted to go with a more intense highlighting and paint job. As for the final highlight, I would use a little bit of Fenrisian Gray, and this really adds in that final blue. Makes me kinda miss painting Ultramarines. I've never really truly had the hate boner that most of the older fans have had, though I don't entirely blame them. What can I say? One of the good modern things GW has done is actually made the Ultramarines cool again. Slight tangent aside, to finish off these highlights, I would end up using some Dryad bark to create the nice little etches in the paint. This is one of my favorite methods if you're familiar with my content, and I'm sure I'll be using it throughout the entirety of the video, but this Marine is basically number 10 in terms of what I edited, so I'm sure I'll be repeating things. I ended up making some really beat around details in the model, and I ended up making one of the eye sockets a little bit busted open, but I really like how that looks. It's really intense, this Marine has been through hell, and with those final details finished up, I was left with one of my favorites of the set. This guy has been through hell, and he's ready to pull out the spines of any Xeno that dare breathe in his vicinity. We don't care if the Tau is just minding his own business, we're going to pull his skin off like Pyramid Head. But now that I've driven all 3 Xenos players off of this video, I think it's about time we get to the next Marine.
Hi, friends. Wait, who the hell are you people? Where am I? Gulp. Well, everyone gets sent to the evil-ass Mish dungeon to die sooner or later, so I guess that it is what it is, but in these trying times, I like to think about a cool little chapter of nice fellas who like flamers and being the nice guys of 40k. Mostly by default, but they are pretty nice dudes relative to Murder Kill Guy and literally the devil, so let me talk about, and Mish paint about probably, or whatever he does on his dumb little channel, one of the nicest, if not the nicest, Space Marine chapters around. The Salamanders are one of my favorite chapters and my former favorite chapter because I love the idea of a relatively kind soul in the grim darkness of the far future just giving their all to protect those who can't protect themselves. Space Marines are genetic monster men who can hardly be called humans. Most chapters are callous at best and gleefully murderous at worst. But the Salamanders legitimately care about the people of the Imperium and will do everything in their power to protect them. To me, they embody the idea of the Emperor's Angels more than most. However, also at the same time, the quote that we're the angels of death, not the angels of salvation, is pretty damn hard, so maybe the Salamanders are dumb stupid heads after all. Nah, I'm just kidding. The Salamanders are salamantastic. And if you aren't won over by them being the chapter to retain the most of their humanity, then surely you can be won over by big ol' flamethrowers, baby! Woo! Part of them saving the little guy is flaming, melting, and thunderhammering the mean guy trying to kill the little guy. And they sure know how to do that. And they do all those crazy things especially well because the third pillar of their culture is that the Salamanders are master blacksmiths and make their own artisan gear. So they have a bunch of badass master-crafted and artificer gear, often adorned with cool-ass dragon designs. But anyways, as for what they did in the Badab War, honestly, nothing super notable compared to the key players. But regardless, they would initially be neutral in the conflict and would of course later side with the loyalist forces. Then they did some cool Space Marine battles, yada yada, you know how it is. And then they would eventually be forced out of the war when their ship was damaged and the Astral Claws and Executioners made a treaty with them to allow safe passage as long as they resigned from the war. However, the Astral Claws, those wily bastards, would betray the Salamanders and do a bit of goofy, silly war crimes when they raided their gene stock and killed the surrendering Marines for even more gene seed. This prompted the Executioners to turn on the Astral Claws as their actions were now clearly beyond the line, as if, the giant war wasn't. But later, the Salamanders would defend the Executioners' honorable conduct, earning them a lighter punishment than some other guys. The lamenters. Well, sorry, fellas. But yeah, that's the basics of the Salamanders. I really like them, and honestly, I hardly scraped the surface. I recommend you all read more into them as they're a really cool chapter. And also, thank you, Mr. Mash, for forcing me to make an appearance on your silly little channel. Hope the rest of your Badab videos is epic as this awesome part that I made, which is definitely the best part. Everyone clip it, everyone share it, all that cool stuff. Anyways, subscribe to Mishmash or whatever and give them all your money. Why don't you just give them all your money? Yeah, give them all the money. Woo! Salamanders are green, like the money that you want to give to Mishmash. How about that? Yeah, okay, well, anyways, bye.
For the kitbashing of the Salamanders figure, I used an old push fit from Dark Imperium, which has admittedly seen some better days. However, I will say, do be patient, this figure ended up being one of the best. To begin gluing him together, I ended up using one of the arms from the Salamanders upgrade kit, and I would end up using some thicker Tamiya to make it adhere properly. His other arm would come from a Reavers kit, and I would use a backpack from the Space Marine Push Fits line, as well as one of the little lanterns from the Salamanders upgrade kit as well. This figure is a little bit more bombastic than the rest, but I think it works for the Salamanders. Considering they're the only first founding legion within the Badab War series, I felt a little bit more generous. Plus, I've never kitbashed a Salamander on the channel before. Now for the Pauldrons, I'm using Mark IIIs again. I know I've been using a lot of these in this series, but you can't tell me this isn't a perfect fit for this figure. After adhering both of them, I would give them a melon from, yet again, the Salamanders upgrade kit. I don't really like relying too much on upgrade kits to make kit bashes, but I wanted an excuse to paint some Salamander's flesh. Now to arm the Salamander, I gave him a classic flamer from the tactical kit. Out of all the old classic designs to be shelved over the new Primaris ones, this one is the most egregious in my opinion. Pyroblasters are to suck. But now that he's fully kitbashed, by the way I did give him a hand from the Pyroblasters kit, ironic, we can begin painting him, and I'll start by using a Zenithal Prime and some deep yellow from AK Interactive. The original Salamander scheme. Yes, we're going for the Rogue Trader design. Though they did not canonically use this scheme in the Badab War of Current Era, this is still my favorite. And I love Marines Malevolent. Hehehe. To begin shading this, I would actually use a little bit of Iyanden Yellow. I would have used Cassandora Yellow, but I didn't have any, and watering down the Iyanden Yellow was actually pretty perfect. It's still a nice deep shade, even when watered down. But now we get to the black, and the first thing we have to do is paint the torso and the power pack. Simple as. But you might be thinking that painting on the stripes is a pain in the ass. Let me tell you, it's really not that bad. The big thing that you gotta do when painting this is to make sure that the paint is actually a little bit thicker than you'd want it to be. Really, with freehanding this type of stuff, the last thing you want to do is add on paint that is too watery. That is how we mess up this scheme. You just have to be really patient and just continually gliding your brush. Just be sure to keep a good tip on the brush and just allow yourself to glide along. You can get a little carried away with this, and I think I almost did on a couple parts, but by and large, it's really kind of relaxing. But now that I've painted out all the little stripes, I begin painting the metallics of the chest plate using some dark silver. And after doing so, I'd begin painting the flesh of the salamander using a little bit of rubber black. This is a great color for starting out salamander's flesh. Once that's fully dried, we can then paint the iconic red stripe down the middle using some burnt red. And we'll also use the burnt red on the muzzle of the flamer, just to create some cool little Rogue Trader era designs on the flamer itself. Once that's dried, we can then begin highlighting the edges of all the black using a little bit of gray. For this specifically, I'm mixing a little bit of black with some glass moonlight from Bear Cavalry. This is a great color for making black highlights. You just want to hit the edges. You don't have to highlight every single band of the black because, let's face it, that would take forever. Now to highlight the yellow, I'm using some warped yellow from Army Painter. I'd also mix glass moonlight with the rubber black for the skin of the salamander. This provides a nice bluish gray color. It does look rather intense now, but I promise you it will dry much darker. Now to highlight the yellow, I'm using some warped yellow from Army Painter. This is a great yellow, it's almost moon yellow, and it really works for this scheme. We'll also be using this on the flamer muzzle, creating some cartoony flame designs. Considering I didn't really know what to do for the other schemes and designs for the OG salamanders, I ended up just using some more decals rather than freehanding it, so I felt it'd be appropriate to do this on the flamer. Now to highlight the chest piece, I'd use some lead belcher, and we can now begin the process of adding in our flames to the little heraldry at the top. To do this, I ended up using some really interesting colors from Green Stuff World, this being the intensity inks. First I would use white, this being OSL white, and then I'd begin glazing using hydromial yellow. This is a really nice cheesy yellow, very similar to Imperial Fist, but it glides really smoothly over the white, and then I could begin shading in using the Phoenix Orange, just to create more of a dynamic color. I'd have to do a couple coats to really get this down, but it works pretty well in the end. Considering this is basically two colors, it works really well, and I would begin dry brushing some black, this being a little bit of coal black from Pro-Acryl, to create the smoke effects. And after doing this for a good amount of time, this turns out really nicely. For something that's only 3 paints, this is pretty sweet. I could go in further detail, but we got 20 figures to paint. So after I was happy with the flames, I would fill in the eyes using a little bit of orange red from Pro-Acryl. With that final detail, our salamander is complete. And let me say, I was terrified of painting this scheme and I love how it turned out. And it was actually quite a lot of fun to paint. You'd think it would be nightmarish, but I gotta say, wasn't that bad at all. I've painted plenty of this scheme before in the form of Marines Malevolent, but it can't really prepare you for the black bands. But like I said, they're really not that bad. So if you're feeling brave, give this scheme a try. The Salamanders are definitely one of the fan favorites of all time, so I think it's pretty cool to finally get to this chapter. But I think we have plenty more chapters to get to, so let's move on to the next one. One of the most mysterious and secretive chapters in 40k history is none other than the Star Phantoms. Founded in the 23rd Sentinel founding and supposedly Dark Angel successors, these guys are truly isolationists through and through. Initially based in the mausoleum world of Hakoneth, the chapter would eventually become fleet-based by necessity upon the destruction of their planet. Though maybe not to the likes of the Minotaurs, these guys are highly dangerous Space Marine killers. Once former allies, they almost completely wiped the Marines Malevolent off the face of the galaxy. Their deadly skills combined with their amazing heraldry, these guys truly embody the name of the Star Phantoms. The Star Phantoms' culture is unorthodox to say the least. Though some chapters definitely have their own rituals and traditions, the Star Phantoms believe the Emperor to be the Imperator Mortifex, essentially viewing the Emperor as the god of death and themselves the true embodiment as the Angels of Death. The sentiment of only in death does duty end is engraved into the very minds of every single Star Phantom. As for the disposition within the Badab War, the Star Phantoms played a vital role in the closing stages of the conflict. They were a key player on the final assault of the Palace of Thorns, left Huron's capital on Badab Primus. spearheaded by the chapter's battle barge, the Memento Mori, alongside a second battle barge, the Pale Wrath, as the chapter undertook their role in the battle with a powerful force of 7 strike cruisers, 25 escorts, and assault vessels with various classes. The Star Phantoms would utterly decimate the Astral Claws in this attack. Over-exceeding in their overall victory, however, their final task was to confront Huron himself. Zucrawl and Huron would engage in a one-on-one affair, resulting in Huron being blasted by his Meltagun point blank. He would, however, take the life of Zucrawl, all while the remaining Astral Claws would rally one final time against the Star Phantoms, which resulted in the losses of innumerable battle brothers. Despite this, however, the Star Phantoms would be honored by being granted overlordship of the now ruined worlds of the Badab sector, allowing them to finally build a new fortress monastery on the ice moon of Jaga. Also metal detail, but the Memento Mori was actually used as the base of their new fortress monastery. Now, I think it's pretty obvious by this point these guys are Dark Angel successors, even though they and the Dark Angels themselves heavily deny this. But look at those colors, look at how sneaky they are, and look at those plasma guns. Ain't fooling anybody. I think it's pretty easy to say that these guys are undoubtedly one of the coolest chapters in the setting. Unrelentingly edgy and looking like a badass while doing so, the Star Phantoms are undoubtedly one of my favorites of the war. And despite ending up at the tail end of the conflict, they are undoubtedly a key factor in why the Loyalists won. Also, fun continuity error. Despite only roughly being around 3,000 years old, Imperial records indicate that the Star Phantoms actually fought alongside the Flesh Tearers around 100 years after the Horus Heresy. Ooh, secret. In all seriousness, I think these guys are one of the coolest Space Marine chapters to exist. An embodiment of edgy rule of cool. Only issue is painting them. That is kind of a challenge. Speaking of which, let's get into the kit bashing and painting. To begin kit bashing the Star Phantom, I would first clip off a push-fit arm and arm him with a classic combi bolter, this being the plasma gun bolter from the classic Space Marine Captain kit. I would then fit it onto an old veteran body, and I would end up using some bits that I did end up eventually removing. This being the helmet from the original Dreadnought, and I would give him another free arm, along with a magazine. However, I didn't think this helmet was exactly ideal. It's close, it's really close, and actually we end up using it later, but I ultimately decided to use one of the Knightly Black Templar helmets, and I would have to slice away at the symbol. I'd also Dremel in some bullet holes, mostly because I just like how it looks. I was pretty loosey-goosey in how I ended up kit bashing the Star Phantom, mostly because it's a chapter I wanted to do justice, but at the time of kit bashing him originally, I actually didn't have the bits I really needed to fully do what I wanted. Hence why he does not have a power pack up until later on. I did end up supplying him with some extra canisters for the plasma gun, but the power pack I ended up using would be added off screen, this being another from the Dark Angels biker kit, and you'll see it once we get into the painting. Now for the actual painting itself, I would actually just spray coat the entire model using black, and then simply zenithal over using dark ivory from Puracryl. Is it really zenithaling if it's actually a base coat? It doesn't matter. I then end up painting all the black areas using some AK Interactive Black, this being the metallics and the robes. Side note, the black robes are really cool. I'm so used to painting cream robes, this was a nice change of pace. I then begin sponging on the white armor using Trooper White from Two Thin Coats. This is kind of a fun little process, though we are going to be shading over. This is a combination of a little bit of Apothecary White and Soulblight Gray from Citadel, roughly 1-to-1. It's also watered down, just so I can have a little bit better consistency. And to be clear, we are washing over the entirety of the white armor. While that dries, I'll be picking up the highlights on the robe by using some rubber black from AK Interactive. I'll be doing this not only on the robe, but also on the little side pieces. Now to come back to highlighting the model, we'll be using a little bit more Trooper White on the sharper highlights. I want to go really stark with this, as I do like how it looks overall. I always like how the Star Phantoms look, primarily because my buddy actually draws a lot of these guys, so I'm used to them looking a little cartoony. Now, to really highlight the robes, I decided to mix together a little bit of the Trooper White with the Rubber Black, just to apply it in a sharper highlight. This looks really bright gray at this point, but I assure you once it dries, it looks a lot cleaner. I also decided to apply a little bit of black to the knee pad, just to do some squad marking. Now for the gold, I used a little bit of rich gold from Puracryl. This is a pretty nice color, it's rather smooth, and it is a little runny unfortunately, but it's the perfect color for our base coat. You can add more gold onto the model if you wish, though Star Phantoms I don't really necessarily see needing a lot of gold. The white and black contrast is already nice enough as is. In fact, I was even tempted to paint it black, but whatever. Now, coming back to the gun, I decided to base coat it using a little bit of dark silver. Now, normally I don't go over the metallics of the bolt guns besides the casing, but this is imperative for the casing itself. Now, to begin the shading process for the metallics, I decided to use some Oblivion Black Wash mixed 1-to-1 with Battle Mud Wash, the classic duo. To paint the eyes, I would use a little bit of white, and I would fill the lenses in using some Flesh Terror's red. I was actually struggling there because almost every red contrast is something Blood Angels related. Not complaining, I like those guys. We'll also actually be using this same color on the muzzle of the plasma gun, as one of my favorite details of the Star Phantoms is their red muzzles on the plasma guns. In fact, this is actually something I love doing in general. This chapter just has it canonically. Another reason why I like the old plasma guns, they're a lot easier to freehand. Now to begin picking out the highlights on the chest plate, I decided to brighten things up by using a little bit of light bronze. This kind of brings it to a white gold look, which I actually like a lot better than just doing a traditional gold color. Now for the bolt gun casing, I would do the Star Phantom's color scheme by adding a couple of bright white lines. It's a really simple color scheme, but considering it's basically a mirror of their chapter badge, I think it looks rather cool. In fact, I think quite a few of the chapters we've gone over in this video have something very similar, but whatever. It looks cool. Spice up your bolt gun casings, dude. I'd also add a little bit of the same black I used for the rest of the bolt gun casing just to add some chips, and with that final detail, our Star Phantom is complete. And may I say, for something that I wasn't feeling entirely too confident on, I was actually kind of shy to paint this one, because I don't paint white all too often. I really like how this looks. I really like the chapter to begin with, so that was a huge reason why I really wanted to get this right. But additionally, they're just a really neat chapter. In fact, I actually painted one on the channel before. Check out that video if you're interested. But I like to think this second go was a lot better. Thankfully this time I was not 48 hours sleep deprived. Might have to build these guys again though. I had a lot of fun with it. But that'll have to come another day. Let's move on to the next chapter. Ah, the moment I've been waiting for. The Sons of Medusa. Possibly my very favorite Space Marine chapter in the entirety of 40k. By this point, you guys should know that I love the Sons of Medusa. I've only done about 4 kit bashes, including this one on this channel. And yeah, you can probably expect more. But when it comes to the actual lore of the Sons of Medusa, their organization and creation as a chapter is very controversial. They are successors of the Iron Hands. Formed in the 36th millennium, a theological and political rift would give birth to the Sons of Medusa. This would be known as the Moray Schism, a strange and controversial doctrine that emerged amongst the Mechanicum. The Moray sect taught that the Omnissiah and the Emperor were one, and that the machine god's divine will was revealed through prophecy. This belief system was both radical and heretical to much of Mars, however, some Iron Hand successors embraced it. With the threat of a full-fledged civil war within the Iron Hands brewing, an agreement would fully be reached to create the Sons of Medusa chapter. Despite being fully exiled, the Sons of Medusa still saw themselves as wholly part of the Imperium. And still Iron Hands, although reduced to a ragtag fleet, swiftly set about locating and destroying enemy targets. However, over time, they slowly began to increase their number and strength, commending their gene seed to higher Imperial authorities, and conducting their duty as if they were still part of their mother chapter. However, by this point, they were still essentially using the iconography of the Iron Hands, which would lead to them fully be reorganized and ratified as a chapter of Adeptus Astartes within the Emperor's grace. And they would now be branded as the mean green, mostly machine marines we all know and love. The Sons of Medusa, to say the least, are essentially a more dogmatic version of the Iron Hands. Oh, the Red Talons are a more dogmatic version of the Sons of Medusa. What sets apart the Sons of Medusa, rather than just being simply an Iron Hand successor, is their overall organization. The chapter is divided into 3 distinct fleet-based war clans. Each fleet is accompanied by a company of marines, commanded by a captain, and attended by a subordinate role by a dedicated chaplain as Master of Doctrine and Discipline, or more directly known as the Iron Thanes. Future Kitbash video. As for their role within the Badab War, the Sons of Medusa would be called in as reinforcements after the secession had been fully declared as heretical. Maybe not to the degree of the Minotaurs and the Space Sharks, but the Sons of Medusa were definitely one of the scarier chapters the secessionists had to face. First starting alongside the Red Scorpions and Star Phantoms, the Sons of Medusa would apply cold, calculated strategy and devastating mechanicalized warfare in a bid to create some devastating attritional warfare. The Sons of Medusa, in tandem with the Red Scorpions, formed a pretty nice bond, all things considered. Despite being rather difficult to command, as no Sons of Medusa would actually take the command of anybody outside of their chapter, their pragmatist nature did get along quite well, all things considered, and they did have some prior history. The Sons of Medusa would have a couple of defeats, mostly at the hands of the Executioners. Because of this, towards the end of the war, the Salamanders and Sons of Medusa would nearly come to blows over the Executioners standing down. Considering the Executioners cost him a strike cruiser, I can understand it to a degree. I still forgive you, Executioners. The last major engagement the Sons of Medusa would partake in the Badab War was to be a hard-fought assault on the orbital fortress of Sentinel Sigma in preparation for the final attack on Badab Primus. The Sons of Medusa would be forced to work alongside the Exorcists, which was a little shaky to say the least, as they had some serious culture clash. But they managed to get the job done as they fully suppressed and sabotaged the station's guns, allowing the Loyalists to completely fall in. Can't imagine the Exorcists were all too happy to see the Sons of Medusa using exercised heretical armaments, but I don't know, maybe they're just jealous. All in all, I love the Sons of Medusa. They are an incredibly interesting chapter, and like I said, I love Iron Hands, but these guys are just the better version. They may not be the ones making the full-scale assaults, though they could if they wanted to, but there is no better support unit in the galaxy than the Sons of Medusa. I don't care if I'm going full simp mode, I fucking love this chapter. Though they did suffer a couple of losses at the hands of the Executioners during the Badab War, the Sons of Medusa are arguably better than they've ever been. Their strong ties to the Adeptus Mechanicus ensures that they are always stocked on the best weapons, armor, and supplies that any Space Marine chapter could ask for. They are the iron judgment of the Omnissiah, unstoppable in their endless quest to purge the weak. Oh, I'm excited for this one. If you're familiar with my content, Sons of Medusa are one of my favorite chapters in the setting. I think by this point, this is the 4th kit bash I've done on the channel. Starter boy out, the first thing I gave him was one of the Infiltrator's tactical gauntlets. This guy is going to be a little less bionic-y than my normal stuff, but that's just because I wanted to do a little bit of variation. As for his second arm, I decided to attach another Infiltrator arm, though we will be snipping this down later on. I then fit on a Mark 8 Errant pauldron, which just has a little extra detail, and I would add on a little skull pendant to the power pack. However, I decided to change this up later on by using a Deathwatch power pack. This just looked a little bit more techy, and I really like how the Sons of Medusa logo is so generic that I could simply use this instead. As for his weapon, I would then fit on a veteran pattern bolter. Though he has less tech on his armor, I figured this would be a good replacement. Using these older bolters is something I don't really like to do because they look a little too loud, but in the context of a Sons of Medusa, it's perfect. As for his helmet, I used a rather techy captain's helmet from the old Space Marine captain's kit. Definitely a little bit older looking, but I still love how this looks. However, you might notice when we get into the painting, I kept the helmet separate. Makes sense, you gotta paint white, I don't want to paint white over green. The first thing we'd end up doing, however, in terms of the paint itself, is using Waflesh over the entirety of the base coat. Sons of Medusa have very inconsistent colors, and I've actually painted them in various different ways. But I wanted to go for something more equivalent to the Imperial Armor book. For the second coat, I decided to use a little green from Proacryl. This is a nice mediate green. As you can see, we're sponging this on. Just something I wanted to try out. I've been sponging my Marines more frequently, and I thought this might be fun. I'd also begin leaving a slight highlight, or I guess a chunkier highlight of light green from Vallejo Model Color. This is one of my favorite greens, and it is consistent with most of my Sons of Medusa schemes. Now for something really weird. I don't know why, but I got this random itch up my butt to use some of my new panel liners for my Gundam kits on the Sons of Medusa. I just used black liner, and it kinda worked. It looks like oil spill. And thankfully it was so easy to wipe away with the extra sponges that I had that it actually turned out pretty nicely. It's a little bit messy if you're not careful, but since AK Interactive has essentially made a similar product, I thought I'd use the Tamiya version because that's all I have available to me. It was a weird experiment, but I think it turned out nicely and I kind of want to use this more in the future. But to kind of steer us back on track, I began painting the Imperialis using some Moonlight Glass. I just wanted a nice gray color so I could add on some white later on. The white itself would simply be bold titanium white applied in 2 thin coats. Usually I don't like painting super clean whites, as you can probably guess by this point. However, the white on the helmet does differ a little bit from the chest piece, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Now coming back to the green after the wash, I would reapply some of these highlights using a little bit of light green from Proacryl this time. Though I love Vallejo Model Color's light green, this is a little bit more vibrant, and it works quite nicely with this color scheme. It's a little bit different from what I've done. Like I said, I've done a different scheme every time when I paint Sons of Medusa, but I like how it looks. Now to dirty things up once again, I'm now dry brushing over the model using some dark silver. This is a light speckling dry brush, as the Sons of Medusa in most of their depictions typically have a streaked, kind of metallic-y edge to their armor. The scheme is actually quite similar to what I did in the first time I kitbashed Sons of Medusa, but I kind of differentiated this later on. However, I really do like this look in general. It does bring a lot more character to the armor. Now to go even further with the dirtying down, I'm going to be using some orange oxide watered down to a wash consistency. We've done this on plenty of the other Marines, but it especially pops out on Sons of Medusa because these colors just contrast so nicely. It's a match made in heaven, this green and this orange. It's just something that I enjoy doing all the more, and it's kind of why I fell in love with Sons of Medusa to begin with. Now for some of the other panels on the armor, I used a little bit of bold titanium white to not only paint on the tactical gauntlet, but I would also use this to highlight the white armor on the helmet. Though I do prefer the grungy look, I did want to add in these highlights just to make the helmet pop out a little bit more. And for the eyes, I decided to paint these in using a little bit of bronze. Kind of a weird thing to do, but their depiction in Imperial armor kind of has a gold eye look, so I figured this would work. With that final detail, our Sons of Medusa is finished, and you can probably see why I like these guys so much. They're definitely one of my favorites of all time. Just a great color scheme, a great look, and though I'm not the hugest Iron Hands fan, these guys will always have a special place in my heart. It's a chapter I can pretty much endlessly kitbash, and I think in this video I actually went lighter than usual. Yes, I know this is the 5th time or 4th time I've brought Sons of Medusa to the class. I don't care. They're just cool. But before I do more and accidentally kitbash half of these characters into Sons of Medusa, let's move on.
So Mr. Mash asked me to contribute a segment to this video due to my previous experience dispelling demons from my local constabulary to talk to you about the Exorcists. Easily the luckiest Space Marine chapter I've ever seen, because the Exorcist bit is not just about, oh, I exorcise demons. No, the standard method of brother initiation within the chapter is get possessed by a demon, fight off the possession of that demon, and then go to a demon world on the edge of the Eye of Terror being chaperoned by Grey Knights to see how cool I am and how best I can stomp a Stone Cold Steve Austin size 48 boot mudhole into the nearest great unclean one. And also, if that doesn't work out, you might actually be a vegetable or crazy or turn into a possessed marine or a chaos spawn, and your corpse may or may not just be used to house a demon. They also come from the world Banish, and they're coming from the 13th Founding, aka the Dark Founding, because the number 13 is unlucky. I don't know how these guys have not been branded Excommunicate Traitoris. Well, I know why. They don't talk to anybody, and even by Space Marine standards, they're seriously antisocial. But my role here is not to tell you about the entire history of the chapter. That's the Cliff Notes version of it. I'm here to tell you about the Badab War and their role within it, which is actually surprisingly significant despite being pretty late to the party, only arriving after Luft Huron and the Astral Claws were declared traitors. The Exorcists rallied its 2nd, 3rd, and 5th, and basically the entire damn chapter, to stop Huron shenanigans. This force was commanded by the 3rd Company Captain Albric, who, by the way, is an absolute unit of a man, and is described as being as big as an Ogren. Well, Ogren-like, but still, that's pretty freaking huge. This isn't relevant. I'm just shocked that nobody has discussed that. There's an Ogren-sized Space Marine running around. I think that's pretty cool. The role the chapter played was essentially, put me in, coach, wherever you need me. So this could be a fleet blockade force, a defensive army, or as shock troops. Their first deployment was to aid the Sons of Medusa at Signax, which went badly because apparently the two chapters could not get along due to personality clashes. I wonder why. And would pivot to be a part of the invasion of Sagan, a battle that is easily one of the biggest of the entire war, and this is really where the Badab War changed in the Loyalists' favor. One of the notable actions the chapter did was claiming a merchant ship called the Soyuz Maru, boarding it, wiping the floor with the Mantis warriors during that boarding action, and also claiming all of its supplies for the chapter. They quite literally ran the Mantis warriors for their foams and won. After this, not much really happened during the Badab War, but towards the end, the Exorcists played a crucial role, acting as the spearhead force of the invasion of Piraeus and the assault on the Star Fortress Sentinel Sigma, which the Exorcists would control, winning that battle. However, the blockade set up by the chapter, as the actual assault on Badab was occurring, would fail, leading to much of the Astral Claws fleet escaping, not for lack of trying, as while the blockade was breaking, they were firing on anything that moved in an effort to prevent the traitors from escaping, including friendly ships. That did not really go well with a lot of the other Space Marine chapters, but neither here nor there. However, as we all know, Huron and those remained of the Astral Claws escaped, later on becoming the Red Corsairs. So despite a solid batting average of lol raffle stomp out of 10, they choked at the end, which is disappointing, but considering the fact they won almost every engagement they were involved in, it could have been worse. If you want to learn a little bit more about the Exorcists, there's not much out there, but there is some good stuff. Index Astartes Exorcist is a really solid White Dwarf article from a few years back. Imperial Armor Volume 10, Part 2, details their involvement in the war and a lot of their chapter lore. The novel Oath of Damnation is a really good read that shows a lot of the chapter rituals and overall motif in a way that has not really been done up until this point. And lastly, the short stories Within These Walls and The Empty Place are really great reads and were my sources of research for this segment. With that being said, thank you again, Mr. Mashed Potatoes, for your spot in this program. Can you please feed me now? You promised me snacks!
To begin kitbashing the Exorcist, I am again using one of the Space Wolf bodies. I'm going for a very different look for this figure. I'm not a gigantic fan of the Exorcist, but I wanted to do it justice. The problem is I kitbashed an Exorcist before in another video, and I was almost tempted to just reuse that for this, but I feel like that's cheating. Like with all the other Space Wolves bits, I had to slice him clean, and for his main arm, I decided to use one from the Sternguard Veteran set. I'm a huge fan of the coiled purity seal, it just feels very fitting for Exorcists. I would then attach a Space Wolves pauldron to him, as it does have the ruins and I really like the trim of these pauldrons. I'd also arm him with a Horus Heresy shield. There wasn't exactly a huge direction for why I decided to use this, I just thought it would be a really cool and different example of the other Marines that I've made in this video. As for his main armament, I decided to give him a bolt pistol from the same kit as well as an extended arm, and I would give him yet another Space Wolves pauldron. I was almost tempted to just keep the ruins as it almost looks kind of word-bearer-y, or I guess by proxy, Exorcists-y, but I actually sealed these up using some sprue goo. As for his melon, I decided to give him a classic Reaver melon. You know, as much as I bitch about Primaris, I actually really don't mind Phobos, and I really do like the Reavers. I don't care. It's especially befitting for the Exorcists. I feel like these guys should just have these helmets by default. As for his power pack, I went with a classic Mark 7. Part of me kind of wishes I implemented some candles or something, but whatever. I did end up giving him more purity seals from the Librarian kit. I used the Librarian for a Tech Marine kit bash ages ago, so I still had these laying around. With that final detail, this extra zealous goofball was ready for the painting. And to begin painting him, I actually ended up sponging him. I first primed him using dark gray from Puracryl, and I would begin sponging on some burnt red from AK Interactive. Weird, right? I've been using Purakryl's burnt red the entire video. I really like the way the gray contrasted with the red, almost reminiscent of Hellboy. However, I would continue on by sponging, and I went even further with the color overall. I eventually started sponging on some deep red from AK Interactive to really brighten things up to that dark, kind of orangey red that the Exorcists are known for. This color is quite vibrant on the model, and as I sponge further, it is a nice, fine finish. Though it's not necessarily the rough texture I'm used to with sponging materials, it works quite well overall. Now for all the trim on the armor, I'm painting using dark silver. Though I don't paint the pauldrons in this shot, I'm going to be painting their trim using this color as well. I did film the painting of the shield, however. Once the dark silver is completely dry, I'll be going over this using some Black Legion. Though it does look a little bit more stone-like upon further reflection, I still like how this looks. I thought the trim being just plain black would be a little boring, so I thought this is a good way to spice it up. I'd also begin attaching some decals from the 30k sets, this being the Wordbearer's decals. I'd also want to create some extra little detail on the shield itself, as having it just be blank would be really boring. I'd also wash over this using a little bit of Oblivion Blackwash, and I would begin painting the eyes using just a little bit of Dark Ivory. I wanted to create a nice slit in between, and I would fill these in using some Waywatcher Green. I'm just flexing that I have that paint still, just use some green glaze. I then begin highlighting the armor using the deep red once again, just creating some stronger tones, and I would create a final highlight by mixing the deep red with just a little bit of orange red from Puracryl. This just creates that nice orangey color, and it brings everything all together. All in all, not really one of my favorite chapters, but they are pretty fun to paint because I just generally like painting red colors. Admittedly, these guys might be my least favorite in the entire video, don't tell Sam that, but I've grown to appreciate them. Tell you what, make a chapter that's the Exorcist lore and give him the Grey Knights look, I would eat it up for breakfast. Regardless, it was still a fun mini to paint, and I'm pretty proud of what I came up with. But before I get crucified, let's move on to the next model.
Hello there everyone, my name is Revenn/Handy, destroy all wallets and maker of terrible financial decisions. So Mishmash asked if I wanted to talk about one of my favorite Space Marine successor chapters, the Carcharodons, or Carcharodonastra, or the Space Sharks. So the Carcharodons are arguably one of the most well-known Space Marine successor chapters that participated in the Badab War, aside from the Minotaurs and Lamenters. They're also probably one of the most popular now unsupported successor chapters due to how cool and mysterious they are. Also, this is a fun fact. The Carcharodons are speculated to be a chimeric chapter, which means a combination of two founding chapters, which in this case is believed to be a mixture of Night Lords and Raven Guard. I'm sure a lot of you are also familiar with Tyberos the Red Wake. Tyberos is the chapter master of the Carcharodons, and this fan art of the Badab War is also where we get the whole Big as a Primarch fan canon. Okay, saying Carcharodons is getting tiring, so I'm just gonna swap to saying Space Sharks. So Space Sharks are often painted in some shade of gray depending on the painter's preference, with tribal markings or what are called exile markings in lore if you're confident in your freehanding skills, and what are essentially shark teeth, although we don't know if they really are. But they are one of the most popular chapters of Kitbash, even though GW just threw our chapter master into Legends. Special edition Black Library mini please. Okay, now some of the significant bits of lore about them from the Badab War. When we're first introduced to the Space Sharks, Loyalist forces were both confused and terrified because they had no idea who these Space Marines clad in grey armor that had just arrived from Void Space were. To prove his chapter's loyalty to the Emperor, Tiberos subjected himself to being psychically probed, his gene origin analyzed, and he also had an old patent to his chapter saying this is when our chapter was founded. Then once they were set loose, the Space Sharks first displayed their brutality in the Endymion Cluster, the home system of the Mantis Warriors. Then after pretty much annihilating the Mantis Warriors' home system and taking everything that wasn't bolted down like the Blood Ravens, they then helped put an end to the Badab War, assisting in the destruction of the home world of the now renegade Astral Claws. Their role was pretty much a sabotage mission, since stealth and being sneaky is kind of their thing. Their mission? Blow up the reactors that powered the hive cities and planetary defenses. And to no one's surprise, they accomplished their mission, which caused Badab Primus to become a dead world due to tectonic upheaval. From there, after the Badab War, they disappeared into void space and are still around today, with the most recent book Void Exile, which is a pretty good book so far that I still need to finish. And there are some pretty interesting bits of lore that I don't want to spoil for anyone. But the Karkarodon's introduction to the greater lore of the Warhammer universe enshrined their chapter into the hearts and minds of many Warhammer fans, including myself. But thank you, Sir Bishop the Mash, for letting me talk about Karkarodons for a bit.
For the body of our Space Shark, I'm using one from the new Space Wolves kits. I figured these would be a good fit as they're a little bit more dynamically posed than a typical Primaris Marine. Plus, they actually look somewhat like Firstborn, keeping in line with what I'm going for as far as the kitbashing. First thing I had to do was snip down and sand off anything Space Wolves related, however. This being mainly the chest plate. It doesn't take too much, especially on these, as it's just snipping off one small area as opposed to an entire Aquila or Imperialis symbol. And if there's any remnant bits left over, I can always just drill into the armor for bullet holes. In fact, that's one of my favorite things to do more frequently. Now to arm the Space Shark, I'm using one of the arms from the Space Wolves kit as well. However, I would snip off the handpiece as I will not be using any of the bolt carbines. Rather, I'll be using a Phobos pattern bolt gun from the Mark III series. I found this to be a perfect fit considering the way I'm going to be painting this guy. I am much more a Space Sharks fan than I am a Karkarodons fan. Now for his right pauldron, I'm using one from the upgrade Space Marine Command Squad set from the Horus Heresy line. This is a good pauldron. I think adding the studded pauldron was a good idea, but I didn't want to overuse the Corvus pauldrons. Now for his left arm, I'm using yet another from the Space Wolves kit, and to cover up the little runic area that wasn't fully shaved off, I simply added in a holstered bolt pistol. Nothing I love more than easily sweeping a carpet over an ugly spot. This was a little bit difficult to put in place, as it was a little awkward to fit under the arm, but utilizing my hobby knife, it was pretty easy, all things considered. Now for his left pauldron, I simply went with a Corvus pauldron. That way I can paint over it. And for his other armament, I decided to use yet another item from the Space Wolves kit, this being a power axe. However, to cover up the runic piece, I decided to fit in a little bit of terrain paste. This actually works quite well, and it kind of looks like dried blood. And if you know anything about Space Sharks, well, you should by this point, they will have plenty of blood on their weapons. So I thought this would be kind of a fun experimental thing to do. I also covered it up using a little bit of sprue goo, but regardless, I think it looks just fine. Now for the power pack, I decided to use another Corvus power pack. If you can't tell by this point, I'm going for a Rogue Trader look. And to finish the look, I'm using one of the Firstborn helmets, this being a Beaky helmet. As you can probably guess, we are going for the Rogue Trader look to these guys, as yet again, I am not a big fan of Karkarodons. I still think the Rogue Trader look was just kinda unmatched, and this will continue on into the painting. Now to start things out, after a priming of some Panzer Grey from Vallejo, I would begin sponging over the model using a mid-tone gray. This being Iron Man from Bear Cavalry. I decided to go really soft with the sponging, however I quickly decided to just go full balls to the walls with a makeup sponge. Sponging isn't entirely my thing, but this model was a great example of how much it can be fun to do. It's all a matter of picking the right colors. And once I went to the brighter highlight by using a little bit of glass moonlight, It was pretty nice. And it really does look like that classic Space Sharks gray. The grungy look is also befitting for them. They're insane. What else is there to say? Also, for the harder to reach areas, I ended up using an earplug. This is actually one of my secret weapons. These things are great for both sponging and applying decals. But we won't be needing decals for this one, as I decided to freehand the bullet bill symbol. Another hallmark of why the Space Sharks are so much better than the stupid Carcharodons. They're overrated. Admittedly, my camera work kind of sucked butt in this area, but it is a pretty simplistic symbol, so there's not really much to go off of other than paint a circle and a triangle, then 2 other triangles. Paint a bean for the mouth. This is Procurl's burnt red. Paint the eyes using some warm yellow, and you can fill this in using more of your black color of choice. The teeth, I simply just used a little bit of white, and I went kind of jagged with these. And I can just paint over using the black color to really smooth things out. It's pretty simplistic. The only detail that I can really tell you is any trouble is just simply painting a circle. However, if you own Space Marines, you probably own the decal sheet, and you can just use the black circle and paint over that. It's pretty simple. But our freehanding isn't over. After the symbol, we're going to be painting the red stripe on the helmet. Now, keeping this perfectly centered is kind of a challenge for me. You'll probably notice it's a little off-kilter, but considering this is a grungy aesthetic and there's plenty of battle damage, we can do plenty to fix this up. All we gotta focus on is getting this down the middle as best we can, painting on the nose cone, and afterwards you can just sponge on the previous gray. That way it looks natural, and even if it's off-center, it's not like people will notice, especially if you're playing for tabletop. Just don't go too far with it, it will look a little weird. Plus you want the red to stand out. Now to begin highlighting the armor, I decided to add just a touch of white to the Glass Moon Light. I'll just be focusing this on the edges, I'm not going for too high in detail, and because I like going scratchy, you get the point. We're so many Marines in at this point, if you don't understand, I can't help you. Now to begin painting the studs of the pauldron, I decided to simply use a little bit of dark silver. You'll probably notice I didn't really go over how to paint the bolt gun casing. That's mostly because the Space Sharks have pretty simplistic bolt guns. And I don't really feel like painting the Rock's tattoos on the side of a bolt gun. Now for the eyes of the Space Shark, I decided to simply paint them black and fill them in using gloss varnish. I would paint these in detail, but I think the gloss varnish does a good job on its own. Now to begin painting the blood on the model, I decided to simply use some blood for the blood god, mixed with a touch of regular red paint. Admittedly, I kind of wanted to go for a cartoony blood, something a little bit more animated to fit along the goofy scheme. I also ended up just using my airbrush to splatter it over the model. Not too much, however. To continue with the Rogue Trader look, I decided to go with the classic kill, kill, kill on the side of his knee pad. This is pretty easy to freehand, especially if you have a good tip on your brush. Shout out to our friend Brass for telling me to do this bit. It wouldn't look the same without it. Also, to keep in line with Rogue Trader, I decided to add in a little bit of contrast with some yellow check marks. The yellow clashes nicely with the red, and now our Space Shark is finished. And must I say, though I may not like the Carcharodons, I love the Space Sharks. These guys are one of my favorites from the original Rogue Trader series. I love painting this scheme. It's so wonderfully simplistic, but it's really easy to pull off. And if you're not really comfortable with freehand, this is a great way to start learning. Though I respect going a little bit more far and beyond with a more Polynesian look to the overall armor design, you just can't beat this look. It's so iconic, it's so perfect. I love that stupid bullet bill face. But I should probably stop myself because I could honestly talk about everything I like about this model for hours on end, and we got plenty of more chapters to get through. So let's get to the next chapter.
Heresy Hotline, this is Val.
Hey dog, what's up? I wanted to
Yes, we do take calls from the 41st millennium.
What? No,
Uh-huh.
You're just gonna talk?
Yeah.
Fuck
Sounds
you!
like you have a drawn-out, convoluted civil war with casualties in the billions on your hands. Well, you're in the right place. We happen to be specialists on the subject.
Well, fuck a duck, man. You're
No,
just gonna
we
keep
don't
talking
offer
over me the
financial
entire
compensation
time?
for Space Marine hubris.
Okay, tell me when you...
Good morning, and welcome to a special episode of Heresy Hotline, your one-stop boxcast for up to 99.9% of Horus-related heresies, guaranteed. Today we are going to be discussing the most infamous cautionary tale on the stage of the Badab War, the Red Corsairs. The Red Corsairs are the business end of a backstabbing for the Imperial books. They began as the Astral Claws, a loyalist chapter of Space Marines dedicated to culling pirates and demons in the Maelstrom Zone, a massive warp storm. But when Chapter Master Luft Huron, humiliated by loss and missing several important body parts, sold his soul to the Chaos Powers in exchange for the strength to wage war against the Imperium, the Astral Claws said au revoir to loyalty and backstabbed the backstabbers back. Stab. The Astral Claws realized that pirate angels of death are a lot cooler and sexier than normal angels of death, and after installing BitTorrent, Huron dubbed himself the infamous Huron Blackheart, the Blood Reaver and lord of the newly founded Red Corsairs. Despite the whole selling your soul thing, the Corsairs tend to take a renegade, more Jack Mormon style. They show up to church once in a while and remind you any chance that they get that chaos is the one true lifestyle, but they still drink coffee and Moscow mules when they think no one is looking. The Corsairs only make offerings to the Chaos Gods when they're searching for more power or a combat advantage, instead preferring to expand their influence through good old-fashioned space swashbuckling. They prowl the ruins of the Maelstrom Zone, carving out their slice of the galactic pie on worlds like New Badab, their capital planet, Shovith in the Chagoras system, the fortress world Gartuli, Thaxis and Agriworld, and spaceports like Hell's Iris and Tyrant's Gate. The Red Corsairs are an empire unto themselves, and even War Master Abaddon shelled out 2 Blackstone fortresses to enlist them in his 13th Black Crusade. A ragtag bunch, the Red Corsairs recruit gangs of human cultists, regularly form alliances with Chaos warbands such as the Thousand Sons and the Black Legion, offer sanctuary to washed-up Space Marines with nowhere else to go, and even employ the services of the alien Lohatl and the Taralians. The Red Corsairs, being a frankly mixed bag of nuts, have no set battle cry to announce their presence. Instead, they open every available Vox channel and flood the network with a screaming tirade of profanities and threats. Notable members include the Alchemancer Armanius Valthex, as well as Garyon, Lord Apothecary, known as a pretty swell guy to those who have earned monikers as pleasant as the Corpse Master. Garyon spends his time tinkering with gene seed cultivation, playing God by Maelstrom Light in an attempt to strengthen their numbers. Interestingly enough, no one knows where their gene seed comes from, and no one will ever find out. As the Red Corsairs, their gene seed has an incredibly high rejection rate due to mutations and imperfections, kinda like a bootleg with fucked up subtitles. There's Verngar the Apostate, former member of the Angels in Carmine, Arderic Vons, former Raven Guard that later joined Hanzu's gang of evil McGees. He's famous for driving the Ultramarine Uriel Ventress to tears of righteous fury on Medrengard, when Ventress couldn't wrap his little pea-brain around the idea that maybe Imperium bad. Hrafel Scarvilson, ex-Blackmane of the Space Wolves. Rumor has it that his name gets more consonants with every soul he reaps. Hoxon the Defiler, former Crimson Fists. Originally named Captain Isidore Montes, he claims that he turned away from the Imperium after Inquisitor Matthias Rabe declared exterminatus on an innocent planet to cover up his own crimes, which sounds a lot less sinister than defiling someone with a Crimson Fist. And then, last but not least, there's Huron Blackheart himself. Huron Blackheart is a menace, ruling his renegade empire from the wild seas of the Maelstrom Zone. Thousands of Space Marines follow his command, and millions of cultists and human pirates stand ready to heed the Blood Reaver's call. At his side are the Hounds of Huron, a squadron of deadly jet bikers along with the Huskarls, his Terminator elite guard. Vicious, cutthroat, and utterly beyond mercy, Huron Blackheart is one of the last people you would want to run into in a dark alley. Jubal Khan was one of the unlucky survivors of Huron's cruelty, as during the Corsairs' assault on the White Scar's homeworld of Chagoras, the Great Khan was taken captive by the renegades and tortured so badly that he could no longer fight, a fate worse than death for a Space Marine. There's a recurring theme across the Red Corsairs: betrayal and hubris. If you guessed that it was their pure and noble hearts breaking breaking under the strain of the Imperium of man's evil regime until they're inevitably forced to betray the Emperor and are pigeonholed into chaos worship, you would be less correct than you think, but not entirely wrong. Unfortunately, Tyranids eat, orcs kill, and Space Marines bring empires crashing down with incredible hubris. And the Badab War is the second best example of this in the setting's history. Huron thought that he could challenge the Emperor's domain, and rumor has it that he's out for Abaddon's title of War Master of Chaos. But some characters, like Arderic Vons of the Raven Guard, were honorable warriors once who found themselves face to face with the rotting carcass of the Imperium and couldn't bring themselves to serve any longer. Vons, among others, abandoned his chapter and learned the hard lesson that the Imperium, for all of its atrocious faults, is the lesser of many evils, and that lesson cost Vons his life and his honor, and the Red Corsairs remain a deadly predator for those that jump ship. They prowl the ocean of the galaxy, hunting for anything unfortunate enough to flounder in their waters. Their numbers are many, their strength is great. Even War Master Abaddon may not be safe from Huron's voracious appetite for domination.
Well, as the final kitbash of the video, I realized I didn't kitbash this figure on camera. So, for the Red Corsairs, I decided to make a second figure again because I'm a hack. This was simply a regular Chaos Space Marine body in which I would glue on one of the custom knives from the Kill Team set. I'd then attach a power pack in the form of the old Nurgle power packs. I love these so much. I've used these plenty on old figures. I'd then attach a pauldron from the Emperor's Children set, and I would give him a little satchel from the Infiltrator's Kill Team set. If you can't tell, I'm going for the idea that these guys are indeed pirates, forced to scavenge and use whatever they had to their advantage. As for his bolter, I decided to carve down one from the Emperor's Children kit as well. I really like sanding this down and I accidentally cut off the barrel, giving it a snub-nose look. I'd also fit on any little widgets such as chains and little hands and hooks, just to give him an even more ragtag feeling, and I would finish him off with one of the NovaMarine helmets as it looks a little ambiguous, giving a bit of that 5th ed look to the overall model. I was really happy with this guy, but I'll tell you, the original figure I cannot compare. I really like this figure. I really enjoy painting Red Corsairs. I used to paint them quite a bit. And to show you how I really did it, I ended up painting this guy using some burnt red from Acryl, and I would spray over top using some deep red from AK Interactive. I then began shading the entirety of the model using some classic Carroburg Crimson. My pot is quite old, so I don't know if the new formula is as good as it used to be, but I guess in case, you might want to use a little bit of red tone from Army Painter. And one of my favorite parts about painting Red Corsairs is you can kind of do whatever you want with them in terms of color scheme. So long as you keep the black, red, and gold in some form or another, I think a lot of them really benefit from having all sorts of different designs. Typically I like to paint the legs halfway black, and at least paint one of the pauldrons trim black, and if you're really feeling spicy, you can paint the helmets black. I typically like to go for all forms, and I really like to separate out the colors to really give a lot more character. All the more shame that they don't have decals anymore. I still don't understand why. Considering the Red Corsairs were built up as a big bad really not that long ago, it's kind of a shame to see them fall from grace like this. Another key element I really wanted to make with this figure overall is really making him stand out using some Khorne Berserker bits, mainly so I could have the exposed arm, and the gloves just to really invoke that feeling of a Marine that is forced to scavenge for what he has. And I gotta say, I still love the old Chaos helmets. I don't care if I drone on about it a lot. I really like these old helmets a lot. I miss when they had less detail and were more ambiguous. Now, painting the loincloth, I decided to go for a light gray color. Typically, they are really depicted with this color, however, I mostly went with this just to produce a good amount of contrast. I then began highlighting the raised surfaces using some rubber black, and if I was feeling spicy, I would use a little bit of extra white to really make the highlights stand out, but some of these areas would be covered up using some gold. The gold color itself was a mixture of bronze and a little bit of copper from Acryl. These two colors combined really work well for this color scheme. Even without the copper shaded, it already starts to look really reminiscent of the original scheme. And to really shade it down, I only really ended up using a little bit of Oblivion Black Wash mixed with some Battle Mode Wash. I'm saying that like it's a big deal. I've been doing that for the entirety of this a-million-year-long video. I'd also, of course, use this mixture on all the different metallics on the model. Now, to begin highlighting the black, I would use some Glass Moonlight mixed with a touch of Rubber Black just to tone it down slightly, and I would apply this to all the raised surfaces of the black. I don't really like painting black armor too much, I've never been a fan, but I really do like how this turned out. I think the biggest thing is subtlety. I heavily rely on making armor look damaged, and it's kinda hard to pull it off with black armor. I then finish off the red using a little bit of orange red from Pro Acryl, sketching it into all the raised surfaces and applying this on all the raised highlights. This is a good color to finish off the scheme. I really like the red that they use for the Red Corsairs, so I'm pretty proud of how this turned out overall. Honestly, it wasn't until recently that I really gained a huge appreciation for this warband, and a big part of that is just researching the Badab War itself. But these guys are so undeniably unique that it is just a shame that they've been kind of cast aside. And considering how big the Badab War is, you'd think they'd have a little bit more love and appreciation. But all in all, as the final miniature of this video, I can confidently say he is undoubtedly one of my favorites. I really like this model, and I really like all the models. In fact, I really cannot believe I actually finished this video. It was a huge labor of love, and I've kind of been working on this video since the beginning of the year, which is crazy to say. A lot of these models, if you can't tell from some of the shoddy video quality, were things that I worked on since January. It's really amazing that I finally got to finish this video all around, and I'm sorry it took so long. A big part of that is just changing priorities with the channel and different videos, but all in all, we did it. That's all that matters. And I'm really happy that it finally is just accomplished. And I want to say a huge thank you. Huge thank you to those that helped me out with this video. I really appreciate the voiceover. All of these people are my friends, quite frankly. Not just colleagues. I view these people as my friends. And on top of that, I want to say a huge thank you to you, the audience, for being so patient with me, for taking so long to make something like this. It really does mean a lot. But all in all, I hope you liked it. And if you stuck around to the very end, you're insane. Or you may have just fallen asleep. Or you just skipped ahead because you like Red Corsairs, I don't know. But now that we're at the end of the video, maybe a little bittersweet, but I gotta be honest with you. I need a little break from YouTube. I'm kind of counting this video as my magnum opus so far for the kitbashing stuff, but there's definitely other projects I want to work on. But I've been working on this channel for 2 years non-stop, essentially, and this video has been the culmination of this entire year's worth of work in the background, and the editing process has taken a lot out of me, and I'm ready to be done with editing for a bit. So, your boy's gonna take a little break. Don't worry, it's not gonna be super long. Knowing me, it'll probably be maybe a week. But I'm still gonna be streaming. Stream every Friday. Don't be shy to check it out. But by this point, I've officially finished editing, so I'm tired and I'm gonna go lay down for a bit. But like always, if you enjoyed this insanely long video, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share it with your friends, and remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya.